We wake to the sound of air moving through walls. Not wind, not weather. Something steadier than weather, more deliberate than breath. A low mechanical exhale passing behind panels, through filters, along hidden ducts. For a few seconds, before memory returns, it feels almost natural. Like waking in a building before dawn, hearing the faint labor of pipes and vents. Then the ceiling moves. Not quickly, not enough to startle the body, but enough for the eye to understand that the room is not still in the old sense of stillness. A faint curve runs through everything. The line where the wall meets the ceiling, the angle of a handrail, the seam of a hatch. The floor is firm beneath us, gravity pulling us down with familiar insistence, yet somewhere behind that familiarity is motion. Rotation. A whole world turning to make weight where there should be none. We are not on a planet. We are inside a ship so large that it has begun to imitate one. The first view comes through a narrow observation blister set into the upper rim of the chamber. Beyond it is darkness, but not empty darkness. Stars burn without flicker. There is no blue air between us and them, no atmosphere to soften their points into something gentle. They look ancient, close, and indifferent. The window frame is thick. The glass, if it is glass, carries faint scratches as if generations of hands have touched it, wiped it, leaned against it, trying to understand what lay outside. Below the window, someone has carved a phrase into the composite wall. Not in a language we remember learning. The letters are worn smooth. They have been traced by fingers for years, maybe centuries. They belong to the people of this ship. And those people do not remember Earth. That is the contradiction at the heart of the vessel. It was built because Earth existed. It was launched because Earth had the industry, the science, the fear, the hope, and the patience to imagine a human future beyond one world. Every corridor, every recycled breath, every seed stored in a cold vault, every schoolroom, every machine shop, every sealed door is evidence of an origin. This ship is not a miracle. It is an inheritance. But inheritance can be lost. A generation ship, in the simplest sense, is a hypothetical spacecraft designed for long-duration interstellar travel, where the original crew lives aboard, has children aboard, grows old aboard, and dies aboard, while their descendants continue the journey. It is a ship that accepts from the beginning that the people who depart will not be the people who arrive. The mission is longer than a human life, so the crew becomes a population. The population becomes a society. And the society must keep faith with a destination it did not choose and a home it never saw. No real generation ship has ever been built. It remains a concept, a warning, and a kind of mirror. But the idea is not fantasy without structure. It is one of the most demanding versions of interstellar travel ever imagined because it does not only ask how to move a spacecraft between stars. It asks how to keep a civilization alive inside a machine. That machine surrounds us now. The awakening chamber opens into a corridor that bends almost imperceptibly upward at both ends. At first, the curve seems like a flaw in perception, the after effect of cold sleep or injury. Then the body understands the scale. The hallway is part of a ring. The ring is spinning. Somewhere above the ceiling or below the floor, depending on which old habit of direction we try to use, the rest of the habitat continues around and around, its inner surface holding homes, farms, reservoirs, workshops, shrines, schools, and quiet places where children have learned to walk under a manufactured sky. The ship was designed for continuity. That much is obvious before anyone explains it. Its builders expected maintenance. They expected birth. They expected death. They expected systems to fail and be repaired by hands that had never touched a planet. They expected that names would change, accents would change, stories would change. They expected time to pass like a pressure against every wall. So they must also have expected memory to require engineering. A starship like this cannot survive on metal alone. Engines do not teach themselves to descendants. Air systems do not remain understandable merely because they are essential. Agriculture does not persist across centuries because a first generation once knew how to tend soil, algae, nutrient loops, or crops under artificial light. A multi-generation voyage depends on knowledge transfer as surely as it depends on power, water, and heat. The map of the ship must be preserved. The reasons for its rules must be preserved. The meaning of alarms must be preserved. The mission itself must be preserved. Yet when we step into the inhabited decks, Earth is absent. Not destroyed in memory. Not mourned. Not argued over. Absent. There are people here, and they are human. They have families, tools, songs, authority structures, rivalries, rituals, fears. They know the ship's seasons, if seasons are what they call the agricultural cycles under the lamps. They know which lifts are unreliable, which bulkheads hum at night, which water dispensers taste faintly metallic after maintenance. They know the old prohibition signs by color, even when the original words have blurred into sacred shapes. They know that beyond the hull is the outside, a realm of cold and radiation and distance. But when asked where the ship came from, they speak of the first decks. They speak of the founders as if the founders were born here. They speak of the vessel as the whole of creation, an enclosed cosmos with no parent world. Earth has become too large a fact to fit inside their culture. This forgetting is not just sad. It is dangerous. Because Earth is not only a sentimental origin, it is the missing context for everything. The measurements built into old manuals, the biological assumptions behind life support, the gravity the rotating habitat tries to mimic, the atmosphere the air system tries to maintain, the crops selected for cultivation, the human body itself, with its bones, blood, microbes, sleep cycles, hunger, and fear, is a record of Earth. Every person aboard is an archive that can walk and breathe, even if the word for the archive has been erased. And the ship is full of other archives. Locked cabinets, sealed instructional terminals, labels in older forms of language, symbols layered over symbols, emergency procedures copied, recopied, simplified, ritualized. Somewhere, there may be an origin record. Somewhere, a message from the people who launched this world into the dark. But an archive does not preserve meaning by existing. It has to be read. It has to be trusted. It has to be connected to a living chain of interpretation. Break that chain, and a library becomes a tomb. This is the quiet terror of waking here. Not that the ship is empty. It is not. Not that the ship is dead. It is alive in 1,000 disciplined cycles. The terror is that it has continued without remembering why. Human beings have succeeded, at least for a time, at the hardest part of the dream. They have carried life between stars. But the story that made the carrying meaningful has slipped away. Outside the observation blister, the stars do not answer. They do not arrange themselves into maps for us. They offer no arrow back to the sun, no label saying home. If the ship still knows its course, it keeps that knowledge inside machinery, inside guidance systems, inside old code, inside compartments guarded by customs no one fully understands. And beneath the floor, the ring keeps turning. Its rotation is not symbolic. It is survival. Its farms are not scenery. They are calories. Its water is not simply stored. It must return again and again through loops no society can afford to misunderstand. A generation ship is not a vessel passing through space with passengers inside it. It is a constructed world, one that must feed, teach, govern, repair, recycle, and reproduce itself across spans of time that can swallow ordinary history. The people aboard have forgotten Earth, but the ship has not. It remembers in its architecture. It remembers in its gravity. It remembers in the pressure of the air and the chemistry of the water. It remembers in every system built to last longer than the builders' lives. To understand what happened to memory here, we first have to understand what kind of world could make forgetting possible at all. A world designed not merely to travel, but to endure for centuries. If the ship remembers, it does so through design. Not memory as a person holds it, not images of oceans, forests, cities, or the blue curve of Earth. The vessel remembers through its insistence on continuity. Through systems that still wake and sleep on schedule. Through corridors that curve with the geometry of rotation. through agricultural decks where light is rationed like weather, through habitation rings planned not for a mission of months, but for lives that begin and end without ever touching a planet. To build such a place, the old engineers had to stop thinking of a spacecraft as a vehicle. They had to think of it as a world. That is the frame Project Hyperion used when it asked designers to imagine a generation ship, not as a sleek interstellar rocket carrying frozen passengers or a small professional crew, but as a self-sustaining ecosystem capable of surviving for centuries. Project Hyperion, associated with the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, treated the generation ship as a layered problem. It needed agriculture. It needed habitation. It needed life support. It needed social systems. It needed the quiet machinery of everyday life, not only the dramatic machinery of propulsion. And in its design competition, Project Hyperion set a stark requirement: a crude interstellar spacecraft designed around a 250-year journey to a habitable planet. 250 years is longer than most nations have kept the same form of government. It is longer than many languages have remained unchanged in daily use. It is long enough for grandparents to become ancestors, for founding instructions to become tradition, for technical terms to become ritual phrases if no one keeps teaching what they mean. A journey of that length cannot depend on the discipline of the original crew. The original crew will be gone. Their children will be gone. Their grandchildren may be gone. The ship must continue under the care of people who never agreed to launch, never saw the departure, and may know Earth only as a word preserved in lessons, songs, or forbidden archives. In our story, even that word has weakened. This is why a generation ship cannot be only a machine. A machine can be maintained, repaired, inspected. But a machine does not raise children. A machine does not decide how to distribute work, authority, food, education, privacy, grief, and hope. A generation ship has to be both machine and civilization, because its mission is not completed by hardware alone. Its mission passes through families, schools, councils, work crews, farms, clinics, archives, and ceremonies. If any one of those layers fails, the ship may keep moving through space while the purpose of the voyage dies inside it. Project Hyperion's framing matters because it places the human system beside the engineering system. Agriculture is not merely a way to grow food. It is a calendar, a labor structure, a source of oxygen exchange and biological stability, a living reminder that the passengers are enclosed within a cycle. Habitation is not merely sleeping quarters and corridors. It is density, privacy, conflict management, childhood, aging, and the psychological reality of spending an entire life inside an artificial environment. Life support is not merely equipment behind panels. It is the invisible agreement that every breath belongs to a loop. And social systems are not decorative. They are survival architecture. On a planetary surface, civilization can fail in uneven ways. A city can import food. A region can draw water from another watershed. A broken machine can be replaced by a machine made somewhere else. A lost text might survive in another library. A generation ship has no such outside. It is a closed inheritance. What it cannot make, repair, recycle, teach, or remember may eventually disappear. That makes every ordinary room aboard the ship more significant than it first appears. A kitchen is part of the food system. A nursery is part of the population system. A classroom is part of the navigation system because someone must eventually understand where the ship is going and why. A maintenance bay is part of the atmosphere, the water cycle, the thermal balance, the agricultural yield. A shrine, a theater, a public square, or a council chamber may seem less urgent than oxygen pumps, but over 250 years, social cohesion becomes as real as pressure seals. A ship like this has to manufacture trust. It has to convince descendants to continue a mission whose origin they did not witness. It has to make duty feel meaningful after the witnesses are dead. It has to prevent necessary rules from hardening into superstition, while also preventing dangerous improvisation from masquerading as freedom. It has to train specialists without allowing knowledge to become a priesthood. It has to preserve enough flexibility for adaptation, but enough discipline that the closed ecosystem is not treated like an open frontier. This is where the forgotten Earth becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a structural alarm. If Earth has vanished from common memory, then something has gone wrong in the very domain Project Hyperion recognized as essential, the continuity of a society over centuries. Perhaps the farms still function. Perhaps the air still circulates. Perhaps the water still returns clean enough to drink. But the social machinery has lost a foundational part of its map. The people know how to live inside the vessel, but not what the vessel once meant. They inhabit the answer to a question no one remembers asking. And the question was enormous. How do you send a living human community across interstellar distance without resupply from Earth, without rescue, without external repair, without any guarantee that the destination will welcome them? How do you design not just for launch, but for year 100, year 200, year 250? How do you make a world small enough to move between stars, yet complete enough that its descendants do not become prisoners of a machine they cannot understand? Project Hyperion's answer, at least in concept, was integration. The ship had to combine physical systems and cultural systems into one long-duration organism. Food, water, waste, air, habitation, reproduction, governance, and knowledge transfer all had to be treated as connected. This is a very different image from older heroic visions of spaceflight, where a crew straps into a craft, survives the danger, and arrives. A generation ship arrives only if generations keep becoming capable crews. That is the quiet terror of it. The launch is not the hard ending of the story. The launch is only the beginning of an experiment in continuity. The real test is whether the ship can remain intelligible to people born far from its makers. Every panel label, every maintenance manual, every crop rotation protocol, every emergency drill, every civic institution must cross a gulf of time. Not the gulf between stars, but the gulf between grandparents and descendants. Between intention and habit. Between explanation and myth. A 250-year voyage also changes the meaning of failure. A short mission can fail suddenly. A generation ship can fail slowly while appearing stable. A sensor calibration procedure is simplified, then misunderstood. A historical lesson is shortened, then omitted. A governance rule is preserved, but its reason is lost. A symbolic phrase is repeated until people forget it was once technical. Earth does not have to be erased in a single catastrophe. It can fade through 1,000 small acts of survival, each one practical at the time. There may have been a century when the children still learned the names of oceans. There may have been a later century when they learned only that the origin world was distant. There may have been a time after that when the origin was treated as metaphor, then burden, then myth. Meanwhile, the ship continued. That continuity is what makes the vessel so haunting. It means the builders succeeded enough for their descendants to remain alive. The ecosystem did not collapse immediately. The habitat did not become unlivable. The life support did not fail beyond recovery. The social order, however altered, endured. The world built to last centuries did, in fact, last. But endurance is not the same as remembrance. In the agricultural decks, lamps still rise over rows of edible green. In the habitation ring, families still wake to scheduled light and artificial gravity. In the service cores, air still moves through filters with that low mechanical exhale. Somewhere in the ship's structure, the assumptions of Project Hyperion have become daily life. The machine and the civilization are still bound together, still carrying each other forward through the dark. Yet the question now sharpens. How many people does a world like this need in order to remain a world? Not just biologically, but culturally. Not just enough bodies to avoid extinction, but enough minds to preserve skill, memory, language, trust, and purpose. A generation ship cannot be crewed only at launch. It must be crewed again with every birth. Its descendants are not passengers awaiting arrival. They are the mission itself. How many people does a world need before it becomes more than a crowd? On a planet, the question almost disappears beneath abundance. Cities lean on other cities. Schools borrow from old libraries. Hospitals train new hands through institutions older than any single doctor. A child can grow up surrounded by specialists without ever seeing the hidden web that made those specialists possible. Farmers, engineers, teachers, electricians, biologists, judges, archivists, nurses, machinists, waste technicians, software maintainers, cooks, parents, repair crews. The planet carries the surplus. The planet absorbs mistakes. A generation ship cannot. Here, population is not just a census. It is infrastructure. It is redundancy. It is memory with a pulse. Project Hyperion, the design study framework developed through the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, treated that fact as part of habitability itself. Its design competition did not imagine a heroic capsule with a few extraordinary survivors sealed inside. It specified a target population of 1,000 people, plus or minus 500. Not millions. Not a nation in the planetary sense. A small town, traveling between stars, large enough to contain diversity of labor, family, education, and governance. Small enough that every loss matters. When we first hear that number inside the ship, it feels almost modest. 1,000 people. We have known neighborhoods larger than that. Schools larger than that. Office towers that could hold the entire living population of this vessel without filling every floor. But on a generation ship, 1,000 is not small in the ordinary way. It is the scale at which a closed society must try to become self-repairing. The ship's population is not only asked to survive, it is asked to replace itself without breaking continuity. The first crew could have been trained on Earth. They could have learned in universities, factories, laboratories, farms, hospitals, and mission centers. They could have arrived at launch already carrying specialized knowledge from a whole planet's worth of institutions. But their children would not have that planet. Their children would learn from the ship. Their teachers would be people who had never seen a natural horizon. Their laboratories would be rooms inside the hull. Their forests would be agricultural decks. Their sky would be architecture. And so the population equation becomes deeper than genetics. A vessel like this must preserve enough biological variety to continue safely across generations. That problem alone is severe. Births, deaths, family lines, illness, age structure, reproductive timing, and inherited risk all become mission-critical variables. On Earth, demography is studied by governments, public health systems, and researchers. On this ship, demography is a life support system, as essential as air circulation or water recovery. If the population falls too low, the ship does not merely become lonely. It becomes brittle. But biology is only the first layer. The second layer is skill. Somewhere in the service corps, there are people who know the sound a pump makes before it fails. Somewhere near the agricultural decks, there are people who can see the difference between healthy stress in a crop cycle and the first sign of system imbalance. Somewhere in the medical bay, there are hands trained to suture, diagnose, sterilize, comfort, and decide. Somewhere in the navigation or operations centers, there are technicians who understand which alarms matter immediately and which are only old ghosts in old software. Every one of those skills has to be renewed. Not once. Not as a ceremony. Not as a story told on Founders' Day, if such a day still exists. Renewed through apprenticeship, testing, failure, supervision, and repetition. Renewed while the people doing the teaching are also maintaining the ship that keeps the classroom alive. This is why Project Hyperion's emphasis on social systems matters. A generation ship is not just agriculture plus habitation plus life support. It is a civilization small enough to know its own faces, yet complex enough to require institutions. It needs education that cannot collapse when one brilliant teacher dies. It needs maintenance protocols that cannot survive only as habit. It needs conflict resolution before resentment becomes sabotage. It needs public trust, because a sealed world cannot afford permanent civil fracture. It needs a way to tell young people why the old systems deserve care. Inside our forgotten vessel, that last requirement has failed in a strange and devastating way. The people are still here. The farms still grow. The air still moves. The ship has not become a tomb. At least not yet. But the shared purpose has been thinned, altered, or severed. Earth has disappeared from common memory. The origin has become a blank place. The mission continues physically, while its meaning has become uncertain. That is the quiet horror of the population equation. A generation ship can meet its head count and still be dying. If the crew forgets why expertise matters, the ship becomes a ritual machine. People may turn valves because their parents turned them. They may recite procedures without understanding the physics beneath them. They may preserve jobs as castes, myths, or inherited duties. At first, that may work. Habit is powerful. Culture can keep systems alive long after explanation fades. But habit is poor protection against novelty. When a sensor fails in an unfamiliar pattern, when a crop disease spreads in a way the manuals warned about, but no one can read with confidence, when a social crisis breaks the chain of training, the society must do more than repeat. It must understand. A population of 1,000, plus or minus 500, gives room for specialization, but not much room for forgetfulness. The smaller the world, the more each person holds. A dead engineer is not one loss among millions. A dead engineer may be the missing bridge between a manual and a machine. A neglected archive is not merely a cultural wound. It may be the reason the next generation misreads a warning label. A forgotten origin is not only sadness, it can become an operational failure. This is why the descendants are the mission, not passengers, not cargo, not an accidental community stretched across centuries. They are the living continuity the ship was built to protect. The original crew was temporary by design. Every adult who stepped aboard at launch was expected, in the cold logic of a generation ship, to die before arrival. Their success could not be measured by whether they personally saw the destination. It had to be measured by whether their descendants still could. That means the vessel's true payload is not only stored seed, frozen samples, machine parts, or mission plans. It is a chain of competent people. A child born in the habitation ring becomes, in time, part of the propulsion of history. She learns the language of ducts, filters, crop schedules, medical alarms, social obligations, and sealed door etiquette. She inherits not a country, but a closed environment. Every lesson tells her, silently, that walls are sacred. Air is shared. Water returns. Waste is never gone. The ship is not outside society. The ship is society's body. But what does she inherit if no one can tell her where the society came from? Perhaps she is told the ship has always been. Perhaps Earth has become a forbidden word, or a nursery superstition, or a mistranslated symbol in a corridor mural. Perhaps the population learned to survive by narrowing its imagination. A destination may still exist in the computers, but a destination without an origin is a strange thing. It turns the voyage into weather. It just happens. It is endured, not chosen. And yet the numbers still press their reality upon everyone. 1,000 people cannot hide from each other forever. In a vessel this size, politics is personal. Education is family memory made formal. Medical ethics becomes dinner table knowledge. A failed harvest is not an economic event somewhere far away. It is visible in ration schedules and the faces of children. A generation ship of this scale must be intimate and bureaucratic at the same time. It needs affection, but it also needs records. It needs trust, but it also needs verification. It needs elders, but it cannot rely only on elders. It needs stories, but the stories must remain attached to working knowledge. That attachment is what we begin searching for. Not just the archive itself, but the living pathway from archive to understanding. A manual sealed in a room is not the same as knowledge transfer. A database is not the same as education. A recorded history is not the same as shared purpose. Project Hyperion's requirement for knowledge transfer mechanisms recognizes that centuries are not crossed by information alone. Information must be carried through institutions, and institutions must be believed. In the corridors, we notice small signs of that belief under strain. A maintenance panel marked with symbols few people use in speech. A classroom where children memorize air cycle songs but cannot explain what carbon dioxide means beyond danger. A civic chamber where population rosters are treated with reverence, as if the count itself were a prayer. Birth schedules discussed in low voices. Apprentices assigned before they are old enough to understand why refusal would frighten everyone. This is not tyranny in its simplest form. It is pressure. The pressure of a society too small to waste talent and too enclosed to let every person choose without consequence. Freedom on a generation ship cannot mean the same thing it meant on a planet. Neither can duty. The population equation reaches into love, family, work, memory, and grief. And beyond all of it, the hull continues its long motion through interstellar dark. 1,000 people, plus or minus 500, living inside a machine built to act like a world. Enough to form marriages, arguments, committees, professions, legends, and schools. Not enough to forget safely. Not enough to lose the thread and assume someone else will remember. Above us, the corridor bends almost imperceptibly. The floor is steady beneath our feet, but the geometry is wrong in a way the body can feel before the mind explains it. The population needs a world. The ship has given them one by turning motion into weight. Homes, farms, and paths cling to an inner surface that curves upward into distance. The society's scale is human, but its architecture is celestial. To understand how 1,000 people can live beneath a sky made of their own world, we have to look at the force holding them down. Not gravity from a planet. Gravity from rotation. Gravity from a spinning sky. The floor is steady because the world is moving. That is the first lesson the body learns here, long before the mind catches up. A cup rests on a table. Dust settles in the corners of a stair. A child drops a tool and it falls. None of this feels miraculous to the people who were born aboard. To them, weight is simply part of the ship's mercy, one of the old conditions that make life possible. They do not need to know Earth to trust the downward pull beneath their feet. But this is not the gravity of a planet. There is no vast rocky body below us, no deep core, no mantle, no ocean crust pulling every object inward by mass alone. There is only motion, carefully shaped. The habitat turns, and everything inside it is pressed toward the outer rim. The effect is familiar enough to live by, strange enough to reveal the ship's origin. Gravity here is not something found. It is something engineered. In the research history behind this kind of world, one of the clearest images comes from the 1975 NASA and ASEE Engineering Systems Design Summer Program at Stanford University. That study, later published as NASA SP413, Space Settlements, a Design Study, investigated how people might permanently sustain life in space on a large scale. It did not describe our fictional generation ship. No such ship exists. But it gave space architecture one of its most enduring visual languages, the Stanford torus. A torus is a ring, a donut shape. Imagine a vast wheel in space, not solid all the way through, but hollow and habitable along its rim. Now imagine that ring rotating. On the inner surface of the outer rim, people walk, plant fields, build homes, move through avenues, and look upward. What they see above them is not empty sky in the ordinary planetary sense. It is the opposite side of their own world, curving overhead. The Stanford torus concept used rotation to provide Earth-normal gravity on the inner surface. That phrase matters because it carries an entire philosophy of settlement. A space habitat is not just a container full of air. It must persuade the human body that it is somewhere it can survive. Muscles expect resistance. Bones expect load. Fluids in the body expect an up and a down. Agriculture expects roots to know where to grow and water to know where to settle. Rotation gives a habitat a direction that biology can understand. On our ship, the effect is everywhere, but most visible when the corridor runs long enough for the curve to declare itself. At first, the passage seems flat. Then the far end rises. Not sharply, not like a ramp, but with the slow authority of geometry. A line of lamps climbs away from us and eventually disappears behind the arc of the ring. People walk there, impossible-looking silhouettes on a ceiling that is not a ceiling. They are upright in their own place, held down by the same rotation that holds us down here. The ship has made a world by bending the horizon into a circle. For anyone raised on a planet, the instinct is to think of the sky as separation. The sky is what is above the world, beyond the reach of roads and roofs. In a torus-like habitat, the sky becomes a mirror of habitation. Farms lie overhead. Water channels glint in the distance. A cluster of dwellings curves above the central open space, their windows facing inward across air. Paths line the inner surface, not as decks stacked one above another, but as neighborhoods arranged along the inside of a rotating ring. This visual logic changes how a society imagines itself. On Earth, the horizon suggests elsewhere. On the ship, the horizon suggests return. Walk far enough in the right direction, and the world comes back around. The road is not an escape into distance. It is a loop. The architecture teaches continuity, even if the culture has forgotten the reason continuity mattered. That is why this chapter of the ship's design feels like an archive. The people aboard may no longer remember Stanford, NASA, the summer study, or the publication number NASA SP 413. They may have no remaining story of the blue planet where such ideas were first worked through in universities and research centers. But the structure itself still speaks in a language of old problems. How do you live in space without a planet? How do you give children a down? How do you build fields where there is no soil beneath them except what you carried? How do you make a settlement, not merely a spacecraft? The answer, at least in this branch of imagination and engineering, is to spin the sky. The motion does not have to be theatrical to be profound. No one feels the ship racing around them as a carnival ride. The rotation has been designed to be ordinary. That is its success. A farmer steps between rows beneath a manufactured sunline. A teacher crosses a courtyard. A maintenance crew opens a panel under a walkway, and the tools lie neatly where they are placed. Everyday life depends on the absence of constant surprise. And yet, there are reminders. Water in a shallow drainage channel does not behave exactly like a river under a planet's open atmosphere. A thrown object may carry subtle traces of the rotating frame. Elevators and ladders are philosophical objects here, because inward is not simply upward. Inward is toward the axis where apparent gravity weakens. The closer one moves to the center of rotation, the less convincing the floor becomes. The body begins to negotiate with physics again. The world reveals that its normality is local. At the rim, where homes and farms are placed, the illusion is strongest. That is where the ship wants its civilization to live. The inner surface is valuable not only because it holds people down, but because it gathers the essentials of settlement into a common geometry. Agriculture can be laid out in long bands. Paths can follow the curve. Homes can face the open interior. Public spaces can be arranged so that citizens see not stars overhead, but one another. This matters for a generation ship because the vessel cannot be only efficient. It must be psychologically inhabitable. A society of roughly 1,000 people, plus or minus 500, cannot spend centuries feeling that it lives in a machine that resents them. They need distance, landmarks, routines, seasons if they can make them, and a sense that their world has edges without feeling like a prison. A rotating habitat offers a kind of compromise. It is enclosed but expansive, artificial but bodily persuasive, finite but curved so that finitude becomes landscape. Still, the contradiction remains. The ship's gravity is evidence of memory and forgetting at once. It proves that someone remembered the needs of descendants with extraordinary care. The builders knew that a mission lasting across generations could not rely on discipline alone. They gave the future a floor. They gave children a place to run. They gave farms a direction, houses a foundation, and streets a horizon. But the descendants, walking those streets, may no longer know why the world is shaped this way. They may have myths for the curve. They may describe the overhead districts as the high arc or the far fields. They may treat the central axis as sacred, forbidden, administrative, or simply technical. They may have inherited procedures without explanations, names without origins, diagrams without the civilization that first drew them. That is the quiet tragedy of good engineering on a forgotten ship. If it works well enough, it disappears into culture. The artificial becomes natural. The designed becomes inevitable. The people stop asking why the ground holds them, because it has always held them. And yet, to wake here with memory intact is to see the old intention in every step. The spinning habitat is not just a setting. It is a fossil of human ambition, descended from real studies that asked how permanent life in space might be made possible. The Stanford Torus was a concept, a design language, a way of imagining settlements beyond Earth. Our generation ship carries that imagination forward into a darker premise, not settlement near home, but continuity far from it, not a colony that can look back, but a world whose people have lost the name of the place that taught them to build worlds. Above us, across the open interior, lights are coming on in the far curve. Morning moves around the ring by schedule, not sunrise. Fields brighten in sequence. Windows catch the glow. Somewhere overhead, someone opens a door and steps out into gravity made by motion, beneath a sky made of neighbors, crops, paths, and roofs. The ship turns. The world holds. But gravity is only one part of the illusion of a planet. Weight keeps feet on the floor. It does not keep lungs filled, crops alive, water clean, or waste from becoming poison. A rotating sky can make a habitat feel like a world, but feeling like a world is not the same as breathing like one. Beneath the streets, behind the farms, through ducts and tanks and chemical loops, another system is doing quieter work. It is not as visible as the curve overhead. It is more fragile than the floor beneath us. The ship does not survive because it carries supplies. It survives because almost nothing is allowed to leave the circle. The ship does not survive because it carries supplies. It survives because almost nothing is allowed to leave the circle. That is the truth hidden beneath the gardens, beneath the rotating streets, beneath the soft domestic sounds of a civilization that has learned to mistake machinery for weather. Every breath taken aboard this vessel enters a bargain. Every cup of water lifted to the mouth has already belonged to someone else, or to a leaf, or to condensation on a cold panel, or to a tank behind a locked maintenance wall. Nothing here is simply used. It is borrowed from the future and expected to return. On Earth, abundance made this easy to forget. A person could turn a faucet and feel no immediate connection to clouds, rivers, treatment plants, aquifers, pipes, or the long engineering chain beneath ordinary life. A person could exhale into a room and trust the atmosphere to accept it. The planet was so large that its cycles felt like background, not machinery. Rain returned. Forests breathed. Oceans stored heat and carbon. The sky itself was a buffer so immense that generations could live inside it without understanding its patience. A generation ship has no such luxury. Its sky is manufactured. Its water has borders. Its air has inventory. NASA's work on deep space habitation gives the problem its stark modern shape. For future habitats far from Earth, NASA has described life support not as a warehouse of consumables, but as a set of recovery systems. Deep space habitats will not have frequent resupply from Earth. That sentence sounds administrative until it is placed inside our vessel, centuries from launch, with Earth no longer remembered. No resupply means no rescue truck. No cargo capsule arriving with replacement water, oxygen tanks, filters, spare parts, and food packages. No outside planet quietly absorbing the consequences of error. NASA's habitation targets point toward the scale of the demand. Future habitat life support, according to NASA's Deep Space Habitation Overview, must recycle at least 98% of consumed water. It must also recover 75% of oxygen from exhaled carbon dioxide. These are not decorative efficiencies. They are the difference between a voyage and a tomb. Imagine the ship as a lung folded inside metal. People inhale oxygen, exhale carbon dioxide, drink water, sweat, wash, cook, grow crops, clean surfaces, tend infants, sterilize tools, and flush waste into systems they rarely see. Every action changes the chemistry of the enclosed world. The life support system must notice, separate, purify, recombine, and return. It must do this not once, not during a mission measured in days, but through generations. The old dream of spaceflight often speaks in terms of supplies. How much fuel, how much food, how much water, how much air. A generation ship forces a harsher arithmetic. Supplies run out. Loops endure only if they are maintained. A tank is a countdown. A cycle is a promise. That is why water becomes sacred here, even if the people no longer know why. In the residential decks, children may learn customs without explanation. They may be told not to waste rinse water, not to damage seals, not to ignore condensation alarms, not to pour unknown chemicals into drains. The rules may survive after their origin has faded. A grandmother may scold a child for leaving a valve open, not because she remembers Earth, but because her grandmother did the same. Culture becomes a protective layer around engineering. Ritual stands guard over chemistry. But rituals are not enough. A system that must recover at least 98% of consumed water cannot depend on good manners alone. It needs membranes, filters, pumps, sensors, storage tanks, contaminant controls, and constant monitoring. It needs environmental systems that can detect when the safe range is narrowing before the crew can taste it. It needs people trained to understand why a trace impurity matters, why a pump's vibration has changed, why a tank reading that seems only slightly wrong may be the first note of a crisis. NASA's list of key habitation systems includes environmental monitoring, air revitalization, water recovery, waste processing, health maintenance, radiation protection, and fire safety. On a planet, these categories belong to separate agencies, industries, and disciplines. A hospital worries about health. A utility worries about water. A fire department worries about flame. A weather service watches the air. On the ship, these distinctions collapse. Everything is close enough to touch everything else. A fire is not only a fire. It is an oxygen event, a smoke event, a toxic gas event, a damage event, a panic event, and a contamination event. A leak is not only a leak. It is lost water, damaged electronics, mold risk, air humidity shift, and possibly an electrical hazard. A sick population is not only a medical problem. It is labor lost from maintenance schedules, infection moving through a closed habitat, and stress placed on air and waste systems. The ship is a civilization, but it is also a patient. Its vital signs are pressure, humidity, oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide levels, microbial load, water purity, filter life, tank volume, crop health, power stability, and human behavior. Its heartbeat is not a single engine thudding in the dark. It is the pulse of pumps and fans, the exchange of gases across materials, the quiet return of water from waste to use. We woke into this heartbeat before we understood the language of it. At first, the life support decks felt less majestic than the ring above. There was no false horizon there, no elegant sweep of farms curving upward into artificial sky. There were ducts large enough to crawl through, pipes color-coded by forgotten conventions, panels sealed with warnings the current crew recited but did not fully interpret. There were reservoirs with inspection lights glowing beneath their surfaces. There were service corridors where the air felt cooler, cleaner, more deliberate. And everywhere, there was the sense of restraint. Not austerity, exactly. The ship's people were not starving in darkness. They had homes, meals, songs, work shifts, schools, festivals, births, funerals. They had made a life inside the machine. But that life had been shaped by a fact most planetary cultures never feel so directly. There is no away. Nothing can be thrown away in the old Earth sense, because away was always a place. A landfill, a river, an ocean, an atmosphere, a distance large enough to hide consequence. Here, away is another compartment. The forgotten Earth survives in the design, even if it has vanished from memory. Whoever built this vessel understood that long-duration survival would depend on recycling, reuse, and waste minimization. They understood what NASA's deep space habitation research makes plain. Beyond the range of frequent resupply, a habitat must behave less like an expedition camp and more like an organism. It must close its loops as tightly as possible. And still, even the best loop is not perfect. 98% water recycling is astonishing, but it is not 100%. Over enough time, the missing fraction matters. Seals weep. Filters trap material. Chemical processes create residues. Human systems are messy because humans are alive. The target itself reveals the danger. If a habitat must recover at least 98% of consumed water, then the remaining loss must be made up somehow, reduced somehow, stored against somehow, or offset by other sources within the system. The margin is small because the environment is small. The oxygen target carries the same warning. Recovering 75% of oxygen from exhaled carbon dioxide means the air loop is partly regenerative, but not magical. Carbon dioxide cannot simply be ignored as a waste gas. It is the shadow of every breath. Too much of it, and thought dulls. Bodies strain. The atmosphere that once sustained life begins to press against it. In a planetary forest, leaves help close this exchange. Plants draw in carbon dioxide, release oxygen, and build tissue from light, air, water, and minerals. On the ship, crops may carry part of that ancient pattern, but they do so inside constraints of light, space, nutrients, disease control, and harvest schedules. The farms are beautiful, but they are not wilderness. They are components. Their green is both nourishment and machinery. This is the unsettling intimacy of a closed habitat. Biology and engineering are no longer opposites. The breath of a sleeping child, the algae in a cultivation tray, the carbon dioxide sensor in a duct, the condensate recovered from humid air, the purified water flowing back toward a galley, the waste stream moving toward processing, all belong to one continuous sentence. Break the sentence, and the ship begins to suffocate. Perhaps that is why the oldest maintenance chants aboard are spoken in a tone almost religious. The people may no longer know Earth, but they know the ship must not be insulted. They know doors must seal. They know alarms must be answered. They know the water discipline and the air discipline. They know that certain rooms are entered only by trained hands, that certain filters are logged, that certain pressure changes require silence and attention. What they have lost is not the habit of survival. What they have lost is the story that explains why survival has this shape. Because this vessel was not built merely to carry people through space. It was built to carry cycles. The original designers could not pack enough sky for centuries. They could not store enough rivers in tanks and call the problem solved. They had to imitate, in miniature and under constant threat, the planetary loops that once held them without asking for gratitude. And as we stand in the service light beneath the inhabited ring, listening to pumps move reclaimed water through the dark, the central contradiction of the ship becomes sharper. Its people have forgotten Earth, but they live inside an argument Earth taught them, that life persists by return. Water returns. Air returns. Carbon returns. Waste returns. The frightening question is not whether the ship has enough supplies. It is whether its people still understand the loops well enough to keep them closed. Because the next secret of this world lies there, in the place where the word waste begins to lose its meaning. If nothing can truly leave the system, then every discarded thing is only unfinished material. Every breath, every meal, every drain, every harvest leads back into the same dark machinery. On a generation ship, survival is not cleanliness in the old sense. Survival is transformation. Survival is transformation. That is the lesson the ship teaches in its lowest decks, where the air is warm with machinery and the walls sweat faintly around pipes carrying yesterday back toward tomorrow. Above us, families eat in curved apartments under the false sky. Children run through garden corridors without thinking about the soil beneath the leaves. Someone rinses a cup. Someone exhales. Someone drops food into a disposal chute and calls it gone. But aboard a generation ship, gone is a dangerous word. There is no away. This was not only a poetic idea. It was an engineering problem that NASA studied under a name that sounds almost too clinical for the world it imagined: Controlled Ecological Life Support System. The abbreviation was CELSS. In that research, tied to long-duration spaceflight and associated with work at NASA Ames Research Center in Moffett Field, California, the central challenge was direct and unforgiving. A spacecraft traveling far from Earth would need ways to convert wastewater into usable water, waste products into food, and carbon dioxide into oxygen. Not metaphorically, not as a symbol, as a requirement for continued life. On Earth, these conversions are performed by a planetary system so vast that most of us never have to see its working parts. Rainfall, rivers, oceans, microbes, forests, soil chemistry, sunlight, weather, and time all participate in the long recycling of matter. The planet hides its machinery inside landscapes. A fallen leaf becomes soil. Soil feeds roots. Roots feed animals. Animals exhale carbon dioxide. Plants take it back. Waste is diluted, buried, decomposed, carried, transformed. The ship has to do the same thing without a planet. It has no ocean except what it carries. No atmosphere except the air trapped inside its pressure hull. No deep soil horizon stretching across continents. No weather large enough to forgive a mistake. Its biosphere is not wrapped around a world. It is folded into tanks, trays, filters, pumps, crop beds, ducts, microbial systems, and human routines. This is why the word ecological matters ecodynamics. A generation ship is not simply a machine that supports life. It is an artificial ecology, a small, engineered argument with entropy. Its survival depends on keeping substances in motion through forms the crew can use. Water must not merely be cleaned. It must be returned to the body. Carbon dioxide must not merely be removed. It must become oxygen again, or become plant matter, or both. Human waste and plant waste cannot simply be sealed away forever. They contain carbon, nitrogen, minerals, and energy pathways the ship cannot afford to lose. The society above may have forgotten Earth, but every meal it eats is still built from Earth's oldest lesson: life is circular. In the agricultural ring, this truth has become almost invisible through repetition. Nutrient solutions move through root beds. Green leaves open under controlled light. Moisture condenses and is gathered. Crop residues are routed back into processing streams. The waste from one human act becomes the input for another biological process. The apple peel, the breath, the wash water, the dead root, the gray liquid from a drain, each belongs somewhere. Each has a destination. Each must be claimed by the system before it becomes contamination. And this is where the horror becomes quiet. Because a forgotten Earth does not necessarily mean forgotten machinery. The pumps still run. The crops still rise. The air still holds enough oxygen for speech. The people still know which valves not to touch, which alarms matter, which corridors require masks during maintenance cycles. Their culture has preserved practice, even if it has lost origin. They may no longer know the names of oceans, forests, or the planet that taught engineers what a biosphere is. But they know the ritual of separation bins. They know the social shame of wasting clean water. They know that a clogged reclamation line is not a plumbing inconvenience, but a civic emergency. A child aboard this ship may learn, before learning history, that every object has a second life. Not because the lesson is noble, because the alternative is death. NASA's CLSS research gives the fictional vessel its harshest realism. Long-duration spaceflight is not only about propulsion, radiation shielding, or navigation between stars. It is also about digestion, about sewage, about the chemistry of breath, about whether a closed habitat can keep turning the byproducts of living back into the materials needed to live again. The ship is a cathedral of unglamorous miracles. In one chamber, wastewater passes from something socially unclean into something chemically recoverable. The distinction matters. Human disgust is not the same as physical impossibility. On a planet, disgust can be solved by distance. We move refuse away from the table, away from the house, away from the city. On the ship, distance is too small to save anyone. The only real purification is transformation. In another chamber, carbon dioxide accumulates from thousands of lungs and is captured before it can make the air dull and dangerous. The crew may speak of air as if it is a shared blessing, but technically, it is a maintained composition. Too little oxygen and bodies fail. Too much carbon dioxide, and thinking itself becomes heavy. The atmosphere of the ship is not a background. It is a product, renewed continuously by systems that must understand both chemistry and biology. And somewhere between those processes, waste products are asked to become food. That sentence should stop us for a moment. Waste products to food. It sounds like a collapse of categories, as if the ship has blurred the boundary between what is rejected and what is sacred. But biology has always lived by this collapse. The problem is not that waste can become food. The problem is making that conversion safe, stable, efficient, and acceptable inside a sealed human community for generations. Here, the technical and the cultural become inseparable. A life support system can process matter, but a society must consent to live inside the truth of that processing. It must accept that purity is not a simple state. It must teach children that clean water may have once been breath, sweat, urine, condensation on a wall, or fluid in a root bed. It must make peace with the idea that every banquet is assembled from returns. This is where the loss of Earth becomes more than sadness. Earth was the original reference system. It was the example that made ecological life support imaginable. The engineers who designed this vessel knew they were imitating planetary cycles in miniature. They knew that forests turned carbon dioxide into oxygen, that microbes broke down waste, that water moved through endless changes of state and use. The ship's closed loops are not an invention from nothing. They are a compressed memory of a planet. But the people walking the ring no longer know that. They live inside an imitation after forgetting the original. So the machine becomes myth. Maintenance instructions become ritual language. A composting fault becomes a moral omen. A bad harvest becomes not just an agricultural failure, but a tremor in the covenant between citizens and ship. The artificial biosphere does not only feed bodies, it shapes belief. Imagine the social map that grows from this. Those who work near the waste streams may be both honored and avoided. They keep the world alive, but they handle what others prefer not to imagine. Water technicians become guardians of return. Agricultural crews become interpreters of hunger and chemistry. Air system workers become custodians of the invisible. The old distinction between engineer, farmer, sanitation worker, and priest begins to blur, because all of them serve the same loop. Nothing can truly be thrown away, including responsibility. That is the deeper consequence of CELSS thinking aboard a generation ship. Closed ecological life support is not just hardware. It is a discipline imposed on civilization. If a community believes it can discard endlessly, it is behaving like an open system. If it knows every discard must return, it has begun to think like a spacecraft. The ship's laws would reflect this. The ship's etiquette would reflect this. The ship's architecture would reflect this. Drains would not be passive holes. They would be entrances to a public trust. Food waste would not be trash. It would be a delayed harvest. Breath would not be private. It would be part of the common atmosphere. Even death, handled with care and reverence, would confront the same closed reality. Matter remains aboard. There is a tenderness in that, and also a terror. A generation ship cannot afford the comforting illusion that humans stand apart from their environment. The environment is too small. Every life touches every other life through air, water, crops, microbes, and maintenance schedules. The vessel makes ecology intimate. It turns planetary truth into household fact. And still, the system is not magic. It must balance. It must be monitored. It must recover from error. If the people misunderstand one loop, if a biological process drifts, if a waste stream carries something the crops cannot tolerate, if cultural taboo prevents honest maintenance, the closed world can begin to fail from within. The same circularity that preserves life can also circulate mistakes. That is why the lower decks feel so solemn. Not because they are dark, though they are. Not because they smell faintly of wet metal and growth medium, though they do. They feel solemn because this is where civilization admits what it is made of. Not ideals first. Not flags. Not origin stories. Water. Carbon. Oxygen. Nutrients. Microbes. Labor. Memory. The ship's people have forgotten Earth, but they have not escaped Earth's rules. They carry those rules in every tank and root bed. They live because matter returns. And if this artificial biosphere seems astonishing here, sealed inside a vessel between stars, it is worth remembering that humans once tried to test closed ecology under a real sky on Earth itself. Not in fiction. Not in orbit. In the desert near Oracle, Arizona, where glass and steel enclosed miniature biomes and a bold question took physical form: can a small world remain alive when the doors are sealed? The answer was complicated. And that complication is the warning hidden beneath every green leaf aboard the ship. The warning hidden beneath every green leaf aboard the ship begins, strangely, under an Arizona sky. Before this vessel crossed the dark between stars, before its descendants forgot the name Earth, people tried to build a smaller world in the desert near Oracle, Arizona. They called it Biosphere 2. The name itself carried an argument. Biosphere 1 was Earth. Biosphere 2 was the experiment, the enclosure, the attempt to ask whether a living system could be miniaturized, sealed, and kept in balance by design. It was not a starship. It had no interstellar engine, no rotating rim, no centuries-long destination beyond the reach of radio. It stood on Earth, surrounded by the original biosphere, the one that had already solved so many chemical and biological problems that human beings often forget they are problems at all. Sunlight fell on it from the same star that warmed every forest and ocean outside its glass. Help was nearby. Technicians, scientists, tools, replacement parts, and an entire planetary economy existed just beyond the sealed boundary. And still, the question was difficult. Biosphere 2 was built between 1987 and 1991 as a closed ecology facility. It covered 3.14 acres. Its sealed capacity was 7.2 million cubic feet. Those numbers matter because they sound large to a human body. A person standing inside such a structure would not feel as if they were in a bottle. They would see distance, water, plants, air moving through leaves. There was room enough for miniature versions of Earth's own environments: a tropical rainforest, an ocean with a coral reef, a mangrove wetland, a savanna, and a fog desert. In other words, Biosphere 2 did not try to sustain life with one greenhouse and a tank of water. It tried to imitate complexity. That is what makes it such a powerful warning for the ship. A closed world is not only a machine, it is also a negotiation among organisms. The rainforest breathes differently than the desert. The ocean stores and exchanges gases in ways a field does not. Microbes alter soil chemistry. Plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, but not as a simple switch that can be turned up or down without consequence. Water evaporates, condenses, flows, settles, and carries dissolved materials with it. The coral reef, the mangroves, the savanna grasses, the desert plants, each one belongs to a web of conditions. Biosphere 2 placed these webs inside a boundary and asked them to behave like a world. A generation ship asks the same question, but with less mercy. Here, aboard the vessel, the gardens are not symbolic. The tanks and soil beds are not demonstrations. The people waking beneath the curved ceiling do not have a desert outside the glass or an atmosphere waiting beyond an emergency door. The ship's sealed ecology is not an experiment watched from Earth. It is the only Earth its people have left, even if they no longer remember the original. This is the contradiction that follows us through every corridor. The society aboard has grown comfortable with the appearance of nature. Children know which paths lead through the agricultural decks. Elders know when the lamps dim into evening. Families know the smell of wet soil after irrigation. The ship has seasons of a kind, harvests of a kind, weather made from fans and pumps and temperature gradients. But Biosphere 2 reminds us that resemblance is not stability. A miniature rainforest is not a rainforest in the full planetary sense. A coral reef ocean tank is not an ocean with continents, currents, storms, and immense buffering capacity. A fog desert under glass is not a desert joined to a whole atmosphere. The smaller the world, the faster its imbalances can matter. The tighter the boundary, the less room there is for error. Earth can absorb shocks that a sealed habitat cannot. A planet has oceans, rock cycles, vast microbial reservoirs, and atmospheric mass. A starship has compartments, sensors, filters, human maintenance schedules, and finite materials. The ship's people have inherited the visible result of old engineering. They may no longer understand the scale of the gamble. This is why Biosphere 2 matters in our story. It is not an anecdote from the past. It is a message from Biosphere 1, spoken through glass and steel. If a closed ecological facility on Earth, with access to sunlight and help nearby, was complicated to keep stable, then a starship biosphere is not merely more difficult. It is more precarious in almost every direction. Distance changes everything. On Earth, a sealed facility can be opened if it must be. Instruments can be recalibrated by people trained outside the system. Missing chemicals can be delivered. Failed components can be replaced by industries not trapped inside the same enclosure. Even the knowledge needed to interpret the problem can come from universities, agencies, and libraries beyond the walls. On the generation ship, there is no outside supply chain. There is no neighboring biosphere from which fresh soil cultures can be easily drawn. No desert road leads to a warehouse. No university sits beyond the pressure hull. The ship carries its own ecology, its own repair capacity, its own schools, its own assumptions. If a balance begins to drift, the correction must come from within the same closed civilization that depends on the balance for survival. That makes memory part of life support. It is easy to imagine the engineers of the first generation understanding this. They would have known that the vessel was not simply transporting people. It was transporting relationships between carbon and oxygen, between water and waste, between food production and population, between maintenance and education. They would have known that every biome aboard, however artificial, needed caretakers who understood not only what to do, but why it had to be done. But centuries alter the meaning of things. A valve becomes a ritual. A maintenance cycle becomes a festival. A warning label becomes a sacred phrase recited without technical comprehension. A garden becomes holy not because people understand the nutrient flows beneath it, but because their grandparents told them the garden must never be harmed. These transformations may preserve behavior for a time. They may even protect fragile systems from careless hands, but they are dangerous when conditions change. Because closed ecologies do not forgive ignorance forever. In the agricultural decks, a crop failure would not be local. In the atmospheric systems, a chemistry error would not remain abstract. In the water loops, contamination would not be someone else's problem. A generation ship compresses the consequences of misunderstanding. Every mistake travels. Every imbalance circulates. Every unknown eventually arrives in the lungs. Biosphere 2's miniature biomes help us see the ship more clearly. The tropical sections aboard are not decorative parks. The water reservoirs are not lakes in the old sense. The algae beds, soil chambers, microbial processors, and plant growth rooms are not separate from the people who sleep above them. They are organs of a single artificial body. The hull is its skin. The ducts are its breath. The farms are its metabolism. And like any body, it can survive only if its internal systems remain coordinated. The tragedy is that the people aboard still benefit from knowledge they may no longer possess. They eat because someone designed food, water, waste, atmosphere systems robust enough to outlast the founders. They breathe because earlier generations understood that survival depended on loops. They walk through green corridors because the ship was built as an ecological argument. Matter must return, air must be renewed, water must be recovered, and waste must become useful again. Yet the deeper question is no longer whether the first builders understood the problem. The question is whether their descendants still do. Biosphere 2 stood in Oracle, Arizona, as a controlled attempt to enclose complexity. It was bold because it recognized that Earth is not a collection of isolated parts. A rainforest, an ocean with coral reef, a mangrove wetland, a savanna, and a fog desert cannot be treated as stage scenery. They are active systems. They change the air. They move water. They host organisms that alter the chemistry around them. They push back against simplified plans. The starship contains that same lesson, intensified and sealed into metal. And there is something almost haunting in the fact that Earth gave this warning before the voyage. The knowledge existed. The caution existed. The records must have existed somewhere in the ship's original libraries and engineering archives. A civilization capable of launching such a vessel would not have ignored the history of closed ecological experiments. It would have known that a small world needs not only equipment, but continuity of understanding. So when we find a society that has forgotten Earth, the loss is larger than nostalgia. It means the warning may have been forgotten too. The name Oracle, Arizona would mean nothing to most people aboard. Biosphere 2 might sound like a myth if the word survived at all. They might imagine it as a shrine, or an ancestor habitat, or a place in a children's chant about the first garden. But to us, newly awake and still carrying the old context, it is a clue. Somewhere between the builders and the present, facts became fragments. History became noise. Technical memory thinned into custom ethanization. The ship still functions, but functioning is not the same as remembering. That distinction becomes heavier as we move away from the green decks and toward the quieter rooms of the vessel. The biosphere can show us what is at risk. The archives may show us what was lost. Maintenance manuals, origin records, design principles, old histories of Earth-based experiments, all of these could still be present, stored patiently behind sealed doors or in neglected databases. But a record is not the same as knowledge. A library can survive while its meaning dies around it. A manual can remain legible while the civilization that needs it loses the concepts required to use it. A warning can cross centuries and arrive unread. Biosphere 2 tells us that closed worlds are hard to keep alive. The ship tells us something more frightening. A closed world must also keep its memory alive. The ship tells us something more frightening. A closed world must also keep its memory alive. So we leave the garden levels behind. The sound changes first. In the agricultural decks, there is always a kind of weather. Pumps murmuring under soil beds, fans drawing air through leaves, water ticking through irrigation lines, distant footsteps on curved paths. But deeper in the vessel, beyond the inhabited sectors and the familiar maintenance corridors, the ship becomes quieter. Not silent. A generation ship is never silent. It breathes through ducts. It thinks through relays. It moves warmth from one place to another with the patience of a buried animal. But here, the human noise fades. The door we find is not hidden in the dramatic sense. There is no ancient lock shaped like a warning. No sacred emblem. No armed guard. It is worse than that. It is ordinary. A pressure door set into a wall of dull composite, with a label so faded that the current crew has stopped reading it as language. To the people of the ship, this corridor is a dead branch. A place beyond daily purpose. The kind of room children are told not to enter, not because it is forbidden, but because nothing useful is supposed to be there. Inside, the air is dry and cool. The lights wake slowly. Rows of storage columns extend into the dimness, some physical, some digital, some built for redundancy in ways that no one around us seems to value anymore. Cabinets hold printed sheets sealed behind transparent covers. Drawers contain etched plates. Wall terminals still glow when touched, though their interfaces open with symbols that feel both familiar and estranged. Maintenance diagrams. Habitat schematics. Crop rotation tables. Atmospheric cycling procedures. Medical protocols. Social governance frameworks. Training modules. Histories. And then, beneath a cracked protective screen, a word appears that makes the room tilt around us. Earth. Not as a myth. Not as a ritual syllable. Not as the name of a lost moral state, the way some of the shipborne use it in half-remembered sayings. Earth as origin. Earth as planet. Earth as the world that built the vessel. The tragedy is not that the archive is gone. The tragedy is that it has been here all along. This is where the engineering problem becomes a memory problem. Earlier, we traced the loops that keep the ship alive: water, oxygen, waste, food, carbon dioxide, heat, maintenance, labor. Each loop is material. Each can fail in physical ways. A valve corrodes. A crop blight spreads. A filter clogs. A tank grows contaminated. But there is another loop, less visible and just as necessary. Knowledge must also circulate. It has to be taken in, transformed, passed on, corrected, renewed. If that loop breaks, the manuals may survive, but the mission does not. Project Hyperion understood this in its own design assumptions. Its generation ship was not imagined as a simple machine carrying sleeping passengers. It was framed as a self-sustaining ecosystem with agriculture, habitation, life support, and social systems capable of lasting for centuries. Its design competition called for a crewed interstellar spacecraft built around a 250-year journey to a habitable planet. It specified artificial gravity by rotation. It specified robust food, water, waste, and atmosphere systems. It specified habitability for 1,000 people, plus or minus 500. And crucially, it specified knowledge transfer mechanisms. That phrase sounds modest, almost administrative. But on a generation ship, knowledge transfer is as essential as air revitalization. It is the way the dead continue to teach the living. It is the bridge between the people who knew the launch site and the children who will only know the ship. It is how a civilization prevents its own instruction manual from becoming archaeology. The archive room shows what happens when that bridge remains physically present but culturally abandoned. At first, the shipborne technician with us does not understand why we are shaken. She sees the records the way a person might see old ceremonial objects, part of the vessel's inheritance, perhaps interesting but not operational. The maintenance manuals are treated as ancestral documents. Some diagrams have been copied into current practice without explanation. Some procedures survive as chants and checklists. Some warnings have been simplified into taboos. Do not open that valve. Do not reroute that loop. Do not disturb the old stacks. In a stable society, custom can preserve useful behavior long after theory fades. That is one of the reasons the ship is still alive. A person does not need to understand the entire history of closed ecological life support to clean a membrane, calibrate a sensor, or monitor a nutrient tank if the training culture still demands it. But custom is brittle. It can tell you what to do when the expected problem occurs. It struggles when the unexpected problem arrives. The archive contains the why. Why carbon dioxide cannot simply be treated as poison, but must be understood as part of a cycle. Why water recovery cannot be a sacred miracle, but must be measurable, testable, and repaired. Why rotating gravity matters not only for comfort, but for bodies, crops, orientation, and design. Why population is not just census, but mission architecture. Why the vessel carries histories of Earth-based experiments, including closed-world attempts under a real sky, where even on the home planet, the balance of a sealed environment proved difficult. But the people around us lack the context that makes these records usable. A diagram of a toroidal habitat means little if the word torus has become a priestly geometry rather than a design principle. A document about NASA's deep space habitation work means little if NASA is no longer remembered as an institution from Earth, but only as an old acronym embedded in file names. A reference to NASA Ames Research Center at Moffett Field, California, is almost unreadable to a society with no map of California, no lived concept of a continent, no sky with a sun crossing it overhead. Even the idea of resupply from Earth has become absurd to them, not because it was never real, but because it belongs to a world picture that has collapsed. This is how forgetting deepens. Not all at once. Not by fire. Not always by censorship. Sometimes a civilization loses memory by losing the surrounding web that lets facts connect to one another. The archive says agriculture, but the shipborne hear food deck. It says atmosphere, and they hear breath system. It says Earth, and they hear origin myth. It says mission, and they hear maintenance duty. A record can preserve words without preserving scale. The physical room is almost painfully prepared for survival. Whoever designed it expected time to be an enemy. The materials are durable. The storage is redundant. Some files are printed, others etched, others kept in electronic systems that can be awakened in low-power mode. There are instructions for repair, for governance, for education. The archive does not only tell the ship how to keep machines running, it tries to tell the ship how to keep a society coherent long enough to arrive. That is the quiet accusation in the room. This was not an optional museum. This was part of the life support system. Project Hyperion's inclusion of knowledge transfer mechanisms makes the Forgotten Earth more than a cultural tragedy. It makes it a mission failure. Not necessarily a total failure. Not yet. The ship still spins. Its biosphere still cycles. Children are still born beneath its false sky. But the original design problem included continuity of understanding, and somewhere between launch and now, that continuity was damaged. We move deeper into the archive. There are origin records that describe the vessel not as a world, but as a vehicle. There are route files that refer to destinations in the language of astronomy, not religion. There are educational sequences built for generations who would never stand on Earth, but who were still meant to know it. They were supposed to inherit more than survival tasks. They were supposed to inherit orientation. That word begins to matter. Orientation is knowing which way is forward, but also knowing where you came from. On a rotating ship, direction is already strange. Up can curve. The ground can rise into the sky. The horizon can bend back toward itself. Without memory, history bends too. The ship becomes not a bridge between worlds, but the only world there has ever been. And yet the archive resists that lie simply by existing. We find images whose labels the current interface can no longer fully render. We find indexes of languages. We find references to music, natural environments, oceans, weather, cities, forests, deserts. We find diagrams that do not depend only on local speech, but on measurement, pattern, and physical constants. It is as if the builders knew that ordinary language might decay, that institutions might fail, that descendants might open these files as strangers. So they prepared another kind of memory. Not just manuals for technicians, not just histories for teachers. A message built to survive distance, time, and the loss of context. A story of Earth reduced to forms that someone, someday, might decode again. Images, sounds, greetings, a map written not in borders, but in the universe itself. Standing there, in the archive room no one visits, we realize the ship's deepest secret may not be hidden in its engines or its gardens. It may be hidden in the design of remembrance. Long before this vessel forgot Earth, Earth had already practiced speaking to the unknown. It had sent small machines outward, carrying records meant for listeners who might not share a language, a biology, or a world. Gold-plated copper discs. Music. Voices. Natural sounds. A time capsule crossing the dark. The archive room has been waiting for someone who can recognize that idea. Not because it belongs only to the past, because it may be the key to reading the message still buried inside the ship. The archive room has been waiting for someone who can recognize that idea. Not a code at first. Not a command. An idea. If a civilization knows it may be forgotten, it can still choose to leave a message. It can choose materials that endure. It can choose symbols that do not depend entirely on one language. It can gather evidence of a world into a form small enough to be carried, and then send that form into darkness, with no guarantee that anyone will ever understand it. Earth did this once. In 1977, NASA launched Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, two spacecraft built for planetary exploration, but remembered also for something more intimate. Each carried a 12-inch gold-plated copper phonograph record. The object was simple enough to describe and almost impossible to fully comprehend. A disc. A record. A physical archive. A time capsule intended to communicate a story of Earth. Not Earth as a political map. Not Earth as a list of rulers, wars, borders, or claims. Earth as a living planet. Earth as sound, image, motion, water, weather, music, mathematics, and voice. The Voyager Golden Record was not made for a neighbor across the street. It was made for a listener who might not be human. It was made for an intelligence that might not know our languages, our bodies, our instruments, or even our assumptions about what a message is. That is why it matters so much here, aboard a generation ship whose own descendants have lost the meaning of their origin. Because the situation is reversed. Voyager was Earth speaking outward to unknown listeners. The ship's hidden archive is Earth speaking forward to unknown descendants. The problem is the same. How do you make memory survive when context may not survive with it? In the neglected system before us, the pattern begins to clarify. The ship's message is not only a stored database. It is not only a historical file labeled with a forgotten word. It is arranged like an interstellar time capsule, modeled on the logic of the golden record. If language fails, there are images. If images become ambiguous, there are sounds. If sounds lose their names, there is music. If music becomes strange, there are voices, greetings, the shape of human presence preserved as breath and rhythm. The real Voyager record carried images. It carried natural sounds. It carried music from different cultures and eras. It carried spoken greetings in 55 languages. 55 ways of saying, in effect, we are here. That number matters because the record was not trying to reduce Earth to a single voice. It was trying to suggest plurality. A planet is not one sound. A species is not one language. A civilization is not one story told from one room. The golden record's spoken greetings formed a small chorus, not because any unknown listener would necessarily understand the words, but because the variation itself communicated something. Different languages, different mouths, different cadences. One planet. Inside the ship's archive, the same principle appears again. Not as a museum display, but as a survival mechanism. The first recovered layer is visual. Images compiled in sequences, many corrupted but not destroyed. The system shows anatomy, landscapes, machines, animals, buildings, tools, food, weather, water in liquid form, clouds above oceans, human hands holding other human hands. Some images are technical. Some are almost unbearably ordinary. A shoreline, a field, a child's face turned toward sunlight. For the ship's current society, these images are not self-explanatory. A sea might be mistaken for a storage reservoir beyond scale. A forest might look like an uncontrolled agricultural deck. Clouds might seem like vapor anomalies. A horizon, to people born under a curving habitat ceiling, may feel like an optical error. But the archive does not depend on one image. It layers them. It repeats relationships. Water appears with rain, rivers, oceans, drinking, plants, and animals. The sun appears as light, shadow, heat, sky, growth. The human body appears in diagrams, in crowds, in families, in labor, in celebration. Meaning begins not as translation, but as pattern recognition. That is the quiet genius of the golden record as a model. It does not assume that one symbol will carry everything. It builds a net. The second recovered layer is sound. At first, the speakers in the archive room produce only noise, hiss, static, a low vibration that seems to come from the walls. Then the restoration software stabilizes the files, and the ship hears something it has not heard in generations. Wind. Not ventilation. Not the measured pressure flow of life support ducts. Wind moving across an open place. Then water, not in pipes, not in reclamation channels, not in sealed irrigation lines, but water moving freely, falling, breaking, rushing. There are animal sounds, too, difficult for the shipborne listeners to categorize. Calls, pulses, wings, insects, living presences from ecosystems no one aboard has touched. In the real Voyager archive, natural sounds were part of the story of Earth. Here, their echo becomes evidence. Earth was not only a coordinate. It was an environment. It had uncontrolled weather. It had open air. It had living systems not enclosed by bulkheads. For a generation ship, that realization is almost destabilizing. The ship's people have always lived inside designed loops. Air is processed. Water is recovered. Waste is converted. Food is cultivated under management. Every sound belongs to a system, and every system belongs to maintenance. Nothing is simply outside. But Earth, as the archive begins to reveal it, was the great outside. The third layer is music. This is where the room changes. Technical images can be studied. Natural sounds can be classified. But music enters the body before it is understood. The Golden Record carried music from different cultures and eras, selected as part of Earth's self-portrait. Music was not merely decoration. It was proof that humans organized time into feeling. That pattern, tension, repetition, and release, meant something to us before any explanation was attached. The ship's hidden message follows that model. Fragments of music surface through the damaged index. Some pieces are ceremonial. Some are rhythmic. Some are quiet enough that the archive room itself seems to lean closer. The people listening do not know the cultures that made them. They do not know the instruments. They do not know the occasions. But they can tell that these sounds were chosen, preserved, and carried forward. That is another kind of fact. Not every truth in an archive is a number. Some truths are priorities. Someone decided that music belonged beside maps and engineering records. Someone decided that a future without Earth would need more than instructions. It would need a reason to care. The fourth layer is voice. Spoken greetings in 55 languages were included on the Voyager Golden Record. The ship's message contains its own field of voices, and when they begin to play, the archive room becomes crowded with the dead. Not dead in the sense of tragedy only. Dead in the ordinary sense that every generation ship must face. The original builders are gone. Their children are gone. The generations who maintained the first farms, repaired the first spin bearings, taught the first shipborne students the name Earth, all gone. But the voices remain. Some are formal. Some are warm. Some sound nervous, as if the speaker understood the absurd courage of addressing a listener beyond all known context. Some greetings are short. Others carry the shape of blessing. Even when the words are not understood, the intention presses through. A voice directed toward someone absent. A welcome offered across distance. On Voyager, those greetings were aimed into interstellar space. Here, they have become a mirror. The unknown listener was never only alien. It was also the descendant, the child of the mission. The person who would inherit the ship after the language of departure had thinned into ritual, then rumor, then silence. This is why the Golden Record matters to the mystery aboard our vessel. It gives us a precedent. It proves that Earth's spacefaring culture understood the problem of communication across vast separations. NASA's Voyager spacecraft did not carry the record because it was required for propulsion, navigation, or planetary science. The record was a message of identity, a statement that exploration without memory is incomplete. And if the ship's builders knew that, then the hidden message is not an accident. It is not a decorative archive. It is a deliberate attempt to preserve Earth in a form resilient enough to survive cultural collapse. The question becomes sharper. Why was it hidden? A functioning society might have celebrated such an archive. It might have taught its children to listen to the greetings, to study the images, to hear the natural sounds as inheritance. Instead, the archive room is neglected. The context is missing. The people above live inside a miracle of engineering, while the story of the world that built it waits below, sealed in damaged memory. The Golden Record gives us a way in. It tells us how to read the ship's message not as a single lost file, but as a designed sequence: sight, sound, music, language, and eventually, physics. The record was not only content. It also had a cover, and the cover was part of the message. It carried instructions. It carried a method. It tried to teach an unknown finder how to play the record, how to measure time, and how to locate the world that sent it. That is where our attention begins to move now. The images and voices tell us that Earth existed. The music tells us that Earth felt. The natural sounds tell us that Earth lived. But somewhere beneath them is a harder claim. Not just what Earth was, where Earth was. And for that, memory must pass beyond language, beyond culture, beyond even the fragile continuity of human institutions. It must be written into constants, into stars, into clocks that do not care what name a civilization gives itself. The archive's next layer is not a song. It is a map. The archive's next layer is not a song. It is a map. And at first, that feels almost impossible. A map, to us, is usually a familiar object. Lines of coast, names of countries, borders, roads, rivers, grids. It assumes that the person reading it already shares the world of the person who made it unexpectedly. It assumes north and south have meaning. It assumes language. It assumes that a blue shape can be called ocean, that a dot can be called a city, that a label can survive. But the cover of the Voyager Golden Record was made for a stranger who might share none of those assumptions. NASA describes that cover not as decoration, but as instruction. It was a practical surface, etched with information meant to explain how the record could be played, how its timing could be understood, where its makers came from, and how long the spacecraft had been traveling since it left the place that made it. The record itself held images, sounds, music, and greetings. The cover tried to answer a more basic question: how do you open the door? On our ship, the same problem has returned under a different sky. The people around us do not speak of Earth. They do not recognize its oceans, its animals, its languages, its storms. Even the word itself has become unstable, more symbol than location. Yet the hidden archive was not built only for ordinary memory. It was built with the same kind of discipline that shaped the Golden Record. If names fail, use measurement. If institutions fail, use nature. If a culture forgets its origin, leave clues in the behavior of atoms and stars. The first part is almost humble. The cover had to show how to play the record. The Golden Record was a phonograph record, a 12-inch gold-plated copper disc, but that fact alone would mean nothing to a finder without context. A disc is not self-explanatory. A groove is not automatically understood as stored sound. A stylus, rotation, and playback speed all have to become part of the message. The cover therefore included diagrams that showed the record, the stylus, and the method of playback. It was an attempt to communicate a machine's ritual without using a shared language. That detail matters because the archive aboard our generation ship faces the same danger. Information can be present and still remain inaccessible. A manual can sit in a drawer, perfectly preserved, and still be useless to a society that no longer understands the tools it describes. A database can survive while the categories inside it decay into religious images, legal relics, or forbidden metaphors. The Golden Record's cover anticipated that problem. It did not only preserve content, it preserved instructions for recovering the content. The ship's message does the same. A diagram is found beside the stored record, not written in the everyday script used by the ship's councils, not framed as a myth. It is geometry, sequence, repetition. A stylus shape, a path through a groove, a timing mark. Whoever built it knew that the descendants might inherit the object without inheriting the culture that made it obvious. This is where physics becomes a language of last resort. On the Voyager cover, the key to time was the hydrogen atom. More specifically, the diagrams used the hyperfine transition of hydrogen as a reference. Hydrogen is the simplest and most abundant element in the universe, and its behavior is not dependent on English or Latin or any planetary tradition. The transition provides a natural unit, a way to define time and length by pointing to a feature of matter itself. This is an astonishing act of humility. The makers of the record did not say, "Here is our second, trust us." They said, "Here is a physical process. Use it to understand what follows." For the forgotten ship, that is almost sacred. Not sacred in the sense of ritual, but in the sense of durability. A society can rename decks, revise histories, censor archives, lose calendars, and reinvent its origin story. But hydrogen does not participate in the politics of memory. It does not care what the ship calls itself. It does not care whether Earth is remembered as home, legend, error, or nothing at all. The atom keeps its reference. From that reference, a record can teach time. From time, it can teach rotation. From rotation, it can teach playback. From playback, the stored voices can become voices again. Physics becomes the bridge back into history. Then the cover grows larger than the record. It points outward. One of the most famous parts of the Voyager Golden Record cover is the Pulsar map. NASA explains that the cover contains a pulsar map locating the solar system. The specific design shows the solar system relative to 14 pulsars. Pulsars are rapidly rotating neutron stars, and their regular pulses can function like cosmic beacons. They are not fixed forever in the way a carved monument pretends to be fixed, but they offer something extraordinary, identifiable patterns in the sky, patterns that can be measured. The map does not say, Earth is here, in the language of one nation. It says, find these pulsars. Measure their pulses. Use these relationships. The home system is located from the geometry of the galaxy itself. For listeners aboard the generation ship, this changes the emotional weight of the archive. Earth is no longer only an image of a blue planet, no longer only surf, thunder, birds, music, greetings in 55 languages. It becomes a coordinate problem. It becomes recoverable. Not easy, not immediate, but no longer purely mythical. The ship's navigators can compare the diagram to their own star catalogs. They can ask whether the pulsars are still identifiable from the ship's current position. They can model the changes. They can search for the pattern beneath generations of drift. And if they can place the solar system, then Earth is not simply remembered. It is located. That is the quiet power of the map. It does not require belief. It asks to be tested. The cover also carried a clock of a different kind. NASA describes a uranium-238 radioactive clock associated with the Golden Record cover, using uranium-238's half-life of 4.51 billion years. Radioactive decay gives time a deep physical measure. A half-life is not a calendar kept by a government or a ceremony repeated by a culture. It is a statistical rhythm built into unstable matter. Uranium-238 changes slowly, on a scale almost impossible to feel. 4.51 billion years is close to the age of worlds, not the age of a human life. Against that number, the lifetime of a crew member becomes a flicker. A 250-year mission, like the one imagined in Project Hyperion's design competition, becomes brief. Even a voyage of many thousands of years becomes a thin mark beside the patience of atoms. And yet that is exactly why the clock matters. A message crossing interstellar space needs timekeeping that does not panic. It needs a clock that can outlast empires, languages, and archives. It needs something that can say not only where we came from, but how long ago this object began its journey. On the ship, the discovery has a destabilizing effect. The elders have kept calendars based on rotations, harvest cycles, maintenance intervals, and civic successions. Those calendars are real. They sustain the habitat. They tell people when to plant, when to inspect seals, when to change filters, when to gather. But they are local. They begin inside the vessel's remembered world. The uranium clock points to a time before the ship's current society. The hydrogen reference points to a unit outside the ship's law. The pulsar map points to a location outside the ship's mythology. Together, they form a kind of testimony. Not a testimony that depends on a witness still being alive. Not a testimony that can be dismissed as one faction's story. A testimony etched into an object by people who understood the cruelty of distance. They knew that any future reader might be alien. They may not have imagined that the alien would be human descendants who had forgotten their own beginning, but the solution still works. This is the chapter's central revelation. Earth can be remembered without ordinary language. It can be remembered as a set of recoverable relationships. A playback speed derived from a physical transition. A location triangulated by pulsars. A passage of time measured by radioactive decay. A disk of gold-plated copper that does not argue, does not plead, does not translate itself into the politics of the day, but simply waits. In the archive chamber, the protagonists begin to understand why the hidden record was designed this way. It was not only an homage to Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, those small spacecraft launched in 1977 with their own records from Earth. It was a survival strategy for memory. The builders of the generation ship knew that knowledge transfer mechanisms could fail. They knew that schools could become rituals, rituals could become myths, and myths could become silence. So they embedded the origin story in a form that a scientifically literate descendant might someday reconstruct. The tragedy is that scientific literacy itself had become uneven. The ship still has technicians. It still has people who maintain pumps, regulate atmosphere, repair agricultural systems, and monitor rotation. But maintenance knowledge is not the same as cosmic orientation. A person can keep a world alive without knowing where that world came from. Now the map asks them to look beyond the hull. It asks them to treat the sky not as scenery, not as emptiness, but as a coordinate field. It asks them to compare signals. It asks them to listen for regularity, to separate noise from pattern, to decide whether a pulse is natural, engineered, or misread. And this is where the archive stops being only about the past. Because once the crew accepts that physics can carry memory, every signal becomes suspicious in a new way. A pattern in the dark is no longer just a pattern. It might be a beacon. It might be a remnant. It might be an accident of stars. It might be evidence that someone, somewhere, has also learned to write without words. The old record has taught them how Earth once spoke to the unknown. Then the ship's instruments begin to hear something answering from the dark. The old record has taught them how Earth once spoke to the unknown. Then the ship's instruments begin to hear something answering from the dark. Not loudly. Not in the way old stories imagine contact, with a voice breaking across every speaker, or a message arriving already translated into the language of the listener. It begins as a correction on a maintenance display, a narrow excess in the receiver log, a pattern marked for review by an automated system whose purpose most of the crew no longer understands. At first, the bridge ignores it. The ship is full of patterns. Pumps cycle. Radiators flex. Power loads rise and fall with the artificial day. The rotating habitat has its own enormous rhythm, and every deck is wrapped in the mathematics of survival. A signal, by itself, is not a revelation. It is only a question. But the archive has changed the people who are awake now. It has taught them that a message does not have to look like speech. It can be a map made from pulsars. It can be a time reference drawn from hydrogen. It can be a radioactive clock waiting for a reader who understands decay. It can be a design choice made by people who knew they might never meet their audience. So when the receiver flags the same narrow pattern again, the crew does not dismiss it as background. They ask what kind of universe would make it. That question has a real name in the science Earth left behind: technosignatures. NASA describes technosignatures as evidence of advanced life. Not life in the broad biological sense. Not microbes in a warm ocean or chemistry that hints at metabolism. Technosignatures are signs that something has built, transmitted, modified, harvested, illuminated, shielded, arranged, or consumed in ways that nature alone may not easily explain. The familiar example is radio. For more than a century of Earth's own technological history, radio signals were one of the clearest ways a civilization could leak itself into space or deliberately call across it. Radio can cross great distances. It can be patterned. It can be narrow in frequency. It can carry timing, repetition, modulation, and structure. To a listener who knows only physics, a radio signal may be one of the first things that looks less like weather and more like intention. But NASA's description is broader than radio alone. The search can also include non-radio indicators. Chemistry that does not sit comfortably inside known natural processes. Energy absorption and emission patterns that suggest large-scale technology. A civilization might reveal itself not only by speaking, but by the way it uses light, heat, matter, or power. That is what makes the crew uneasy. The signal is not a message they can read. It is not a greeting. It is not music. It is not a human voice in one of the languages preserved in the old archive. It is instead a discipline. A narrow, repeating structure in a sky that should be indifferent. The ship's old astronomical systems begin the slow work of caution. They compare the signal to known natural sources. They check timing. They check the motion of the vessel.
They ask whether the pattern could be made by the ship itself, reflection from a structural member, interference from a power converter, leakage from a navigation array, an old beacon misidentified as something outside the hull.
This matters because a false signal can be more dangerous than silence. Silence can be endured. It can be interpreted as distance, damage, or time. A false signal creates a story too quickly. It gives frightened people a direction to point their hope.
And this ship is already full of people who have lost the largest direction of all.
They have recovered Earth as a fact, but not yet as a home. They have found the idea of origin, but not the living continuity that should have carried it. They know now that their ancestors did not emerge from the vessel itself. They know the rotating world, the farms, the water loops, the archive, and the hidden map all belong to a larger design. But a design still has missing parts. Why were they sent? Where are they going? Who was supposed to guide them after the first generations died? The new signal presses on every one of those questions. If it is from Earth, then Earth may not be entirely gone from the mission. It may have left beacons along the route. It may have sent updates that were never received, or were received and buried. It may have built navigation stations, relay points, or automated infrastructure meant to shepherd the vessel across interstellar distance. In that case, the signal is not alien at all. It is ancestral, a hand extended through machinery. But that possibility contains its own terror. If Earth has been transmitting, why did the ship forget how to listen? A generation ship is not only a vehicle moving through space. It is an institution moving through time. It can lose not just fuel, not just parts, but procedures. A frequency band can become ceremonial. A receiver can become sacred equipment no one is permitted to touch. A console label can survive after the lesson that explained it has vanished. The signal could have been arriving for generations, and the ship's society may have walked beneath it as if beneath weather. If it is from another civilization, the meaning widens beyond anything the archive prepared them for. The Voyager records were made by Earth for unknown listeners. They were humble, physical time capsules attached to small spacecraft, carrying images, natural sounds, music, and greetings. They assumed distance. They assumed uncertainty. They did not assume an answer. But a techno-signature in the present is different. It would mean the ship is not merely remembering Earth's attempt to speak into the cosmos. It is moving through a cosmos where someone else may also be visible through technology. Not necessarily nearby. Not necessarily aware of the vessel. Not necessarily alive at this exact moment, depending on distance and light travel time. But advanced enough at some point to leave a pattern that can be noticed. That idea does not make the crew cheer. It makes them quiet. Because evidence is not companionship. A signal can prove existence without offering rescue. It can come from a world already dead. It can be the side effect of power use rather than a deliberate invitation. It can be old light, old radio, old heat, arriving after its makers have changed beyond recognition. The universe can contain intelligence and still be lonely. Then there is the third possibility, the one that feels closest and therefore most troubling. The signal may be from their own mission. Not from Earth as a living sender. Not from aliens. From infrastructure the crew no longer remembers deploying, passing, or depending on. A navigation marker. A course correction beacon. A probe sent ahead. A relay left behind. A component of the original plan that survived in space after it died in culture. The archive has already shown them that Earth's engineers fought in layers. They did not trust ordinary language alone. They used physics. They used symbols. They used redundancy. They built messages for readers who might be separated from them by time, biology, culture, and ignorance. A generation ship would need the same kind of patience. If Project Hyperion could specify knowledge transfer mechanisms for a hypothetical centuries-long vessel, then the people who built this fictional ship would have known the danger. They would have known that a crew is not one crew, but many crews, born in sequence, each inheriting not only metal and soil, but meaning. They would have known that instructions must outlive the instructors. So the signal might be a test of that inheritance. The crew isolates it again.
The pattern returns.
Not constantly, not generously, but with enough regularity to resist being dismissed.
The old instruments assign it a position against the star field.
The archive's recovered methods give them a way to think about the sky as reference, not emptiness. Pulsars taught them that location can be encoded in timing. Hydrogen taught them that a unit can survive the fall of language. The new signal teaches them that detection is only the beginning. To call something artificial is not to understand it. NASA's technosignature idea is powerful precisely because it requires restraint.
A candidate signal must be tested against natural explanations.
A possible chemical anomaly must be compared with known chemistry. A strange energy absorption or emission pattern must be examined before it becomes a claim about technology. The search is not a license to turn every mystery into a civilization. It is a method for asking whether any mystery remains after the ordinary universe has had its chance to explain itself. On the ship, that method becomes a moral discipline. The crew cannot afford myth. They already live inside the ruins of a failed memory system. If they turn the signal into prophecy, they may repeat the same mistake that erased Earth, allowing meaning to detach from evidence. But if they ignore it, they may abandon the first external clue the mission has offered in generations. So they listen. They listen while the farms continue breathing beneath the lamps. They listen while water moves through recovery loops that must not fail. They listen while the inner sky of the rotating habitat glows with the opposite side of their small world. They listen with instruments built by ancestors whose names have become difficult to place. And slowly, the signal stops being an event and becomes a direction. Not a command. Not yet a message. A direction. When the navigation records are brought into comparison with the receiver logs, another old word begins to surface from the archive. It is not Earth. It is not Voyager. It is not a greeting in any of the preserved languages. It is a destination, or at least a candidate destination, written into mission fragments that were once too abstract to matter. Proxima Centauri b. The name lands differently now. Not as a myth. Not as a place in a forgotten lesson. As a possible endpoint to the long road they have been traveling, without understanding. A planet from Earth's catalogs. A world orbiting the nearest stellar neighbor, carried in the ship's memory even after Earth itself was lost. The signal is still unresolved. It may be a remnant of home. It may be the sign of another technology in the dark. It may be part of the vessel's own forgotten architecture, waiting at the edge of recognition. But for the first time since waking, the crew has something more precise than origin. They have a bearing. The bearing does not restore the past. It only gives the silence a direction. For the crew, that is almost more unsettling than ignorance. Earth had become a broken idea, scattered across archive fragments, engineering manuals, obsolete labels, and songs that no one aboard had grown up hearing. It was a place described by evidence, not memory. A place that had built their ship, stocked its first farms, sealed its first water loops, and sent its first crew into a darkness their descendants would inherit. But Earth itself remained out of reach, not only by distance, but by culture. It had become an origin without a living witness. Proxima Centauri b is different. The name is not warm. It does not carry the emotional force of oceans, forests, weather, or childhood. It is not a home in any ordinary sense, but it is precise. It belongs to a catalog. It can be checked against orbital mechanics. It can be placed in relation to a star. It can be described without myth. NASA identifies Proxima Centauri b as a super-Earth exoplanet. That phrase matters because it is careful. It does not mean another Earth. It does not promise a blue world, breathable air, or a shore waiting under alien clouds. A super-Earth is a planet more massive than Earth but still far below the scale of ice giants such as Neptune. It is a category of size, not a guarantee of welcome. The word sounds hopeful only if the listener forgets how limited the label is. And aboard the ship, forgetting is already the central danger. The exoplanet orbits an M-type star. That is another quiet fact with enormous consequences.
M-type stars are smaller, cooler stars compared with stars like the Sun.
In the ship's recovered files, the classification sits beside diagrams that had become almost religious to some and meaningless to others: stellar types, luminosities, habitable zone estimates, caution marks written by people who understood that a destination could be scientifically interesting without being safe. The crew reads these notes in the archive room under recycled light, with the ship's rotation pressing their feet gently toward the floor. Around them, the vessel continues the daily work that made survival possible long after context failed.
Water is reclaimed. Air is refreshed. Waste is processed. Crops are inspected under lamps.
Children recite maintenance terms whose oldest meanings have blurred. The civilization inside the hull remains alive, but its story has holes large enough to swallow a planet. Then the catalog entry offers a date. The discovery of Proxima Centauri b was announced in 2016. To the awakened crew, that date is almost absurd in its intimacy. It is not ancient in the way stars are ancient. It is not measured in billions of years, like radioactive clocks or stellar evolution. It belongs to human history. It belongs to the era when Earth still had observatories, institutions, research teams, public announcements, and a shared language for telling itself what it had found. 2016 was a year on a calendar that once mattered. Somewhere, on the world no one aboard remembers directly, people looked toward the nearest stellar neighbor and reported evidence of a planet. That announcement becomes a strange kind of relic.
Not a bone.
Not a tool.
Not a monument. A date.
A date means there was a before and after. Before, Proxima Centauri b was hidden in the data, suspected perhaps, but not carried into public certainty. After, it became a named possible destination in the imagination of Earth. A planet in orbit around the nearest star system could enter mission studies, arguments, dreams, calculations. It could become a target for people who knew they would never see it, and for machines or descendants who might. The ship's people have inherited the consequence without inheriting the moment. They have the road, but not the departure ceremony. They have the target, but not the speeches. They have the star maps, but not the faces of the first crew looking back at Earth. They have the machinery of continuity, but not the reason continuity was chosen. The planet's orbit is even more concrete. NASA gives Proxima Centauri b an orbital period of 11.2 days. 11.2 days. A year shorter than 2 weeks aboard the ship. That number changes the way the crew imagines the place. On Earth, a year was once tied to seasons, agriculture, migrations, school calendars, rituals, aging, and memory. On the Generation ship, time has been reorganized around maintenance cycles, crop rotations, sleep shifts, births, deaths, and the rotation of the habitat itself. But on Proxima Centauri b, if the orbital period defines the local year, a calendar could turn with startling speed. A child born there, if children could live there at all, would pass through many planetary years before growing tall enough to understand what a year meant. The orbital distance is just as striking, about 0.048 astronomical units from its star. An astronomical unit is rooted in Earth's old relationship with the Sun. It is the scale of Earth's orbit, carried into science as a measuring stick. Even when Earth is forgotten, its orbit remains embedded in the units. The crew has to confront this quietly devastating fact. Their language of distance still remembers what their culture does not. The unit itself is a fossil of home. 0.048 astronomical units is close. Very close by the standards of the solar system that the archive reconstructs. Yet because Proxima Centauri is an M-type star, closeness does not mean the same thing it would mean near the Sun. The ship's recovered lessons warn against simple analogies. Worlds must be understood in context. Distance, star type, radiation environment, atmosphere, rotation, chemistry, and history all matter. A planet can sit in a region of interest and still be hostile. A planet can be cataloged without being kind. That caution becomes important aboard the vessel because hope is dangerous when it fills gaps that evidence has not filled. Some among the crew want Proxima Centauri b to be the answer. They want the name to resolve the wound left by Earth's disappearance from memory.
If the ship has a destination,
then perhaps its suffering has purpose. If the signal points toward that destination, perhaps the long silence is not abandonment.
Perhaps there is infrastructure waiting. Perhaps another archive.
Perhaps proof that the original mission did not fail, only outlasted its own story.
Others are more careful. They have spent too much time inside broken knowledge systems to mistake a coordinate for salvation. A destination can be real and still be unreachable. A planet can be selected and still be unsuitable. A signal can align with a target and still be misread. The ship's instruments may be detecting a beacon, a relic, a transmission artifact, or a pattern produced by systems no one aboard fully understands anymore.
the recovered NASA facts do not solve that mystery.
They narrow it. That is the power of them.
Proxima Centauri b is not a prophecy written by frightened descendants.
It is not a myth created to keep order in a sealed world.
It is an object from Earth's scientific record, a super-Earth exoplanet orbiting an M-type star, announced in 2016, circling every 11.2 days at about 0.048 astronomical units.
These details are too specific to behave like folklore. They do not ask to be believed in the way legends ask to be believed. They ask to be tested.
And that testing begins to change the ship.
Navigation teams reopen dormant models.
Archive interpreters compare mission fragments with recovered exoplanet catalogs.
Life support officers, who once cared only about the next cycle of oxygen and water,
begin asking what kind of arrival their systems were designed to support.
Teachers revise lessons that had treated old star names as ceremonial.
Children begin whispering Proxima Centauri b, not as a prayer exactly, but as a location.
Still, the contradiction deepens.
How can a society preserve a target and lose its origin?
The destination survived in coordinates, catalogs, and machine-readable records.
Earth survived in damaged archives, symbolic records, and physical traces.
Yet the emotional and institutional bridge between them collapsed.
The ship remembered where it might be going better than it remembered why it had left.
That is not a small failure.
It suggests that information alone was never enough.
A mission can store facts and still lose meaning.
It can preserve a planet's orbital distance while forgetting the world that defined the unit. It can pass down procedures while losing the history that made those procedures sacred.
It can keep moving,
perfectly or almost perfectly, through interstellar darkness while becoming a civilization of passengers who no longer know they are descendants of a launch.
The bearing toward Proxima Centauri
b therefore does not end the investigation.
It sharpens it. If this planet was truly the intended destination,
then the ship was never just a refuge.
It was a bridge across time.
Its farms, its rotating gravity, its closed breath, its archives, its rules about knowledge transfer, all existed to carry human continuity from one star to another. The people aboard were not merely surviving inside a machine.
They were the living cargo of a decision made long before them.
But once that becomes clear, a harder question arrives. Not whether Proxima Centauri b exists.
NASA's catalog gives them that.
Not whether it has a short orbit, or a close path around an M-type star, or a discovery announcement rooted in Earth's scientific past.
Those facts are firm enough to stand on.
The harder question is whether any society can remain itself long enough to arrive. Because a destination measured in astronomical units is only one part of the road.
The other part is measured in generations, in births and funerals,
in lessons remembered and lessons distorted, in institutions that must survive leaders, crises, accidents, and belief,
in the slow erosion of why.
The crew has found a bearing.
Now they must face the length of the road.
The crew has found a bearing. Now the bearing becomes a sentence. Proxima Centauri b is not just a point in the navigation archive. It is not just a super-Earth moving close to an M-type star, or a name that survived in NASA's old catalogs after the idea of Earth itself became fragile. It is a destination that turns every nursery, every schoolroom, every medical record, every quiet argument in a council chamber into part of the propulsion system.
Because the ship does not cross the dark with engines alone.
It crosses with time. In the recovered files,
The crew finds a paper hosted on ARXV, built around a model called Heritage.
it is not a prophecy.
It is not a finished blueprint for human survival between stars. It is a Monte Carlo model, a way of running many possible futures through mathematics, letting births, deaths, pairing rules, reproductive constraints, and population structure interact across long stretches of simulated history. Under its assumptions, the paper estimated something both precise and almost impossible to feel. A minimum crew of 98 people could produce a 100% success rate for a 6,300-year multi-generational voyage toward Proxima Centauri b.
The number first sounds small. 98 people. Less than the population of a crowded lecture hall. Less than the number who might gather in one rotating habitat district for a ceremony.
Less than the number needed to make the ship feel like a world.
But the number is not really about comfort.
It is about demographic survival under modeled conditions.
It belongs to a cold category of thinking,
Where human lives become variables because, on a generation ship, biology is infrastructure.
a birth is not only a family event. A death is not only grief. A reproductive policy is not only private ethics. It is mission architecture. The crew reads this in a room where the lights are regulated by
Systems older than anyone's grandmother, and the meaning of the study moves through them slowly.
6,300 years. Not centuries. Millennia. Longer than any law aboard has existed in its present form.
Longer than any spoken tradition can be trusted to remain unchanged without reinforcement. Longer than any single institution can assume it will survive, unless survival has been built into its bones. Project Hyperion had asked designers to imagine a generation ship for a 250-year journey to a habitable planet.
That was already vast by human standards.
It required agriculture, habitation, artificial gravity, closed life support, social structure, and knowledge transfer mechanisms. It required the ship to be both machine and civilization.
But the heritage scenario
Stretches the question until it becomes almost theological.
What is a promise after 6,300 years? Who is still bound by it?
What kind of culture can inherit a mission from ancestors so remote that they are not grandparents, not founders, not even legends in the ordinary sense, but near mythic figures hidden behind layers of translation, ritual, and repair? The awakened crew understands then that time is not empty.
It is active. It presses against every system.
It presses against memory first. A person can remember a parent's voice.
A community can remember a disaster. A school can teach the names of founders. An archive can preserve a document.
But across thousands of years, each of those methods becomes vulnerable in a different way.
Voices die. Disasters become symbols.
Schools teach what their teachers understand. Archives survive physically while becoming unreadable culturally. That is the danger the ship has already revealed.
The records did not all vanish. Some were still there.
Maintenance manuals, old mission files, cosmic reference points, and messages patterned after the logic of the Voyager Golden Record remained hidden in storage and system memory. The failure was more subtle than destruction. The vessel kept evidence of Earth, but the society aboard lost the context that made the evidence meaningful. The heritage model gives this tragedy a demographic shadow. If a voyage can be modeled as thousands of years of reproduction, then memory must also reproduce.
So must expertise.
So must trust. So must the belief that a destination matters. The model's minimum crew estimate concerns population viability under assumptions. It asks whether enough people with managed reproductive rules and stochastic life events can avoid demographic collapse over the modeled journey. But no Monte Carlo run can guarantee that descendants will still recognize the original purpose of the voyage.
The code can follow family lines. It can simulate outcomes. It can test population survival.
It cannot make children care about a planet they have never seen.
It cannot ensure that an archive room remains sacred rather than bureaucratic.
It cannot prevent a technical term from becoming a prayer, or a navigation chart from becoming an emblem, or the word Earth from losing its referent and becoming only a syllable in old songs.
And biology brings its own long antagonism. A generation ship must
Carry people through birth, adolescence, illness, aging, death, and inheritance in a place where no outside population can easily refresh the gene pool.
The heritage paper matters because it treats that reality as central. It does not imagine the crew as static passengers, sleeping unchanged through the crossing. It treats them as a living population, one that must produce descendants capable of continuing the mission. That means the vessel's social systems cannot be decoration. They are as vital as water recovery or oxygen recycling.
A ship can have rotating gravity, sealed agriculture, and careful waste processing, and still fail if its population rules collapse into faction, neglect, coercion, or despair.
This is where the earlier engineering returns with a new meaning. The closed breath of the ship required loops. Water had to return. Oxygen had to return. Waste had to become resource. Nothing could truly be thrown away. But the 6,300-year problem reveals another loop. Knowledge must return. Purpose must return. Care must return. Each generation has to receive enough from the previous one to keep the system intelligible, and then pass it forward without turning it into something dangerously false. The crew begins to see the ship not as a line moving toward a star, but as a chain of fragile renewals. Every infant born aboard is both descendant and replacement. Every teacher stands between the living and the dead. Every physician protects not only a patient, but the future population curve. Every archivist guards against a kind of extinction that leaves bodies alive and meaning gone. The ship itself seems to know this, in the mute way old machines know anything. It has preserved compartments whose labels no longer match common speech. It has maintained databases that no one consulted. It has carried a destination in its navigation systems and a planetary origin in its hidden records. It has behaved like a patient witness, unable to explain itself to descendants who stopped asking the right questions. And now, under the quiet pressure of the heritage file, the crew must confront the scale of the forgetting. If the modeled voyage toward Proxima Centauri b could last 6,300 years, then the loss of Earth may not be surprising. It may be statistically human, not inevitable, but understandable. Languages drift. Institutions decay. Emergencies reorder priorities. A famine can erase an academy. A conflict can discredit a priesthood of engineers. A sealed archive can outlast the ability to read it. A survival doctrine can become a taboo. A necessary policy can harden into myth. Over that much time, even success can look like betrayal. Perhaps the ship survived by simplifying its story. Perhaps later generations stopped teaching Earth because Earth had become a source of division. Perhaps the destination mattered more than the origin. Perhaps remembering a lost planet made life aboard intolerable. Perhaps leaders decided that a society enclosed inside metal and biology could not afford nostalgia for oceans, open skies, and nations no one would ever visit. Or perhaps no one decided at all. Perhaps forgetting happened the way corrosion happens, not as an event, but as accumulation. A missing instructor. A damaged curriculum. A crisis in life support. A generation that learns emergency repair, but not history. A council that postpones archive education until conditions stabilize. A century in which conditions never quite do. The RIXIV paper does not answer that. It was not built to explain cultural amnesia. It was built to test population survival under particular assumptions across a proposed interstellar timescale. But that is exactly why it unsettles them. It gives the crew a way to measure the abyss between surviving and remembering. 98 people in the model might be enough to begin. A 100% modeled success rate might be possible under the defined conditions. But the ship around them is proof that arrival is not the only definition of success. A civilization can continue breathing and still lose the name of the world that sent it. It can protect its bloodlines and forget its birthplace. It can maintain its systems and misunderstand its mission. It can become the answer to an engineering problem while becoming the site of a historical wound. The crew looks again at the bearing toward Proxima Centauri b, and the destination feels different. Before, it was a hope.
Then it was a fact recovered from old science. Now it is a demand placed on everyone alive aboard and on everyone not yet born. 6,300 years turns the voyage into a test no individual can pass.
Only a culture can pass it. Only institutions can pass it.
Only memory, renewed again and again, can pass it.
And because Earth was not renewed, the question darkens. Was it lost because time was too long?
Or because someone, somewhere in the chain, decided that remembering was more dangerous than forgetting?
The question does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives like a fault report.
A missing field in an archive index. A maintenance doctrine that assumes a homeworld but never names it. A map that can point toward Proxima Centauri b, while the culture that inherited the map cannot say who first chose that star. After the 6,300-year problem, the crew can no longer treat forgetting as a simple accident. Time is powerful, but the ship was designed around time.
That is the point of a generation vessel.
The original crew lives, reproduces, dies, and hands the mission to descendants who will never meet the builders. Project Hyperion imagined such a ship not merely as a spacecraft, but as a self-sustaining ecosystem with agriculture, habitation, life support, social systems, and knowledge transfer mechanisms. In other words, memory was supposed to be part of the machinery. So the investigation changes. The question is no longer only, how did Earth vanish? The question becomes, what kind of failure can erase Earth while leaving the ship alive? The first answer is the least dramatic and perhaps the most frightening because of that.
Institutional failure. Not one catastrophe. Not one tyrant.
Not one forbidden room. Just a long chain of ordinary breakdowns, each small enough to be survivable.
The ship's life support doctrine still teaches loops. Water must be recovered. Air must be revitalized. Waste must be processed.
The old NASA targets for deep space habitation were clear about the direction of travel. Recycle at least 98% of consumed water and recover 75% of oxygen from exhaled carbon dioxide. The ship's descendants may no longer know Earth as a place, but they know that survival depends on return.
Breath becomes carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide becomes oxygen.
Waste becomes food. Wastewater becomes usable water.
Those lessons survived because the penalty for forgetting them was immediate.
A failed pump kills crops. A microbial imbalance threatens a habitat.
A broken air revitalization system changes the taste of every breath. The ship disciplines memory where memory is necessary to live through the week.
But origin does not fail that way.
A child can grow up without knowing the word Earth and still learn how to inspect a water membrane. A council can misname the launch planet and still enforce fire safety. A school can replace history with ritual and still teach the equations needed to maintain rotation. The ship can punish technical ignorance while allowing cultural ignorance to pass quietly from one generation to the next.
This is the first cruel asymmetry.
Life support protects itself through consequence.
History does not.
The second possibility is cultural drift. Not the loss of data, but the transformation of meaning. On a rotating habitat, the world curves upward. Farms, corridors, schools, clinics, and reservoirs cling to the inner surface. The sky is the opposite side of the ship. Children born there do not have to be told that this is normal.
They learn it before language. They learn that down is outward,
That the horizon bends, that the world hums and cycles and has no weather except what systems permit. For people born into such a place, Earth may have stopped being a location long before it disappeared from the records. It may have become a symbol,
then a metaphor,
then a sacred name, or a political name, or a dangerous name, depending on which institution carried it. The crew finds traces of this drift in ordinary speech. The word home is used for compartments, for family lines, for agricultural sectors, for the whole turning structure. The word origin appears in navigation procedures, but rarely in public teaching. The oldest documents speak of departure. Later summaries speak of foundation. Later still, the language becomes closed and circular. The ship is not described as traveling from somewhere.
It is described as continuing. That difference matters.
A society that must survive for centuries, or for millennia, may learn to value stability over accuracy. It may decide, without ever holding a vote, that the important thing is not where the mission began, but whether the mission continues. Over time, the place that launched the vessel becomes less useful than the rules that keep people fed.
The third possibility is more technical.
The archives may have survived, but the decoding context may have died. This is where the Voyager Golden Record becomes more than a historical analogy. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, launched in 1977, carried 12-inch gold-plated copper phonograph records intended as time capsules. Their contents were chosen to tell a story of Earth through images, natural sounds, music, and spoken greetings in 55 languages. The record cover carried instructions: how to play it, how to read the timing through the hydrogen atom, how to locate the solar system with a pulsar map, how to understand elapsed time through uranium-238 and its 4.51 billion year half-life. The brilliance of that design was also an admission. Messages do not preserve themselves by existing.
They must be interpretable. A record needs a reader. A diagram needs a tradition of diagrams.
A pulsar map needs someone who still recognizes pulsars as cosmic reference points rather than decorative lines from an ancient cult object. The ship's archive may be filled with accurate records. Earth may be present in thousands of files. But if file formats changed, languages drifted, institutions narrowed education, or the meanings of old symbols were lost, then truth could remain physically present while becoming socially unreachable.
This is not the same as destruction. It is a quieter kind of loss. A library with locked grammar.
A map with no agreement about what maps are. A phonograph record preserved perfectly in a society that has forgotten sound can be stored as metal, admired as ritual, cataloged as heritage, and never heard. The crew begins to suspect that this happened in layers.
Some origin records were not deleted. They were recategorized.
Some technical manuals were preserved because they supported agriculture, water recovery, air revitalization, environmental monitoring, health maintenance, and fire safety. Other records, the ones that explained why the mission existed, were treated as less urgent. They were moved from operational memory into ceremonial memory, and then from ceremonial memory into obscurity. But that still does not explain the clean absences. It does not explain why some indexes jump around the word Earth. It does not explain why the educational summaries teach the destination more clearly than the origin. It does not explain why certain archive objects require authorization levels that no current office admits to using. So the fourth possibility enters the room, and no one says it loudly at first.
Deliberate suppression. Not necessarily cruelty.
Not necessarily conspiracy in the theatrical sense. A generation ship is a fragile political environment. Project Hyperion's imagined vessel needed habitability for 1,000 people, plus or minus 500. That is enough for professions, factions, family lines, schools, grief, ambition, and disagreement. It is not enough for endless fracture. In a closed world, social instability is not abstract. If conflict damages life support, there is nowhere else to go. The crew asks what Earth might have meant during a crisis. Perhaps it became a promise the ship could not keep. A remembered planet with oceans, open air, and natural gravity would be unbearable to generations who lived under ceilings that curve back into themselves. Perhaps Earth became a political weapon. One faction claiming loyalty to the launch world, another claiming loyalty to the destination, another claiming that the living ship mattered more than either. Perhaps messages from home stopped arriving, or were never possible across the widening dark, and silence itself became a wound. Or perhaps the original mission required a psychological severing. To keep descendants committed to a voyage they did not choose, leaders may have taught continuity without longing. They may have preserved the technical systems and removed the emotional center. A population can endure hardship if the hardship has meaning. But if the meaning points backward to an unreachable world, it may become dangerous. This is the most unsettling theory because it makes forgetting look like governance. The ship may have survived because someone reduced the past to protect the future. And yet, Survival purchased that way has a cost. A culture that forgets its origin loses more than sentiment. It loses a way to judge its institutions. It loses the knowledge that the ship is artificial, contingent, built by people who made choices under pressure.
Without Earth, the vessel can begin to feel eternal.
Its rules can begin to feel natural. Its authorities can present maintenance as destiny. That is why the archive matters. The crew is not simply looking for a birthplace. They are looking for evidence that their world was made and therefore can be understood. If Earth existed, then the ship is not the whole of reality. If Earth launched them, then the mission had an author. If the mission had an author, then someone made promises to the unborn.
Now those promises are returning as fragments. A bearing toward Proxima Centauri, B.
A cosmic signal that may be external, inherited, or misread. A hidden archive modeled on an older human dream, the Voyager records, gold-plated copper, carrying greetings, music, images, and the physics of location across distances no human body could cross. The crew has weighed decay, drift, lost context, and suppression, but none of them fully closes the wound. Each explains part of the silence. Together, they suggest something more complex than a single erased word. Earth may have been lost because memory was difficult. Earth may have been buried because memory was dangerous. And somewhere aboard, waiting beneath authorization locks and obsolete instructions, there is still an object designed for the opposite purpose, not to hide a world, but to carry it. The object is not impressive at first glance. After everything the crew has crossed to reach it, after the sealed doors, the obsolete authorization trees, the names of dead institutions buried in maintenance code, the archive waits in a quiet chamber with no ceremony left around it. No guards. No shrine. No schoolchildren brought here to learn the beginning of the voyage. Only dust held in filters, soft indicator lights, and a device built around an old human instinct. If memory cannot be trusted to survive inside people, put it into matter. The first thing they understand is that it was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a witness. Its design echoes something older than the ship itself, older than the sealed farms and rotating neighborhoods, older than the social laws that now govern births, training, work, and death aboard the vessel. In 1977, NASA launched Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, and each spacecraft carried a 12-inch gold-plated copper phonograph record. The record was not a command system. It did not steer the probes. It did not keep them alive. It was a time capsule, a statement placed inside the dark, carrying images, natural sounds, music from different cultures and eras, and spoken greetings in 55 languages. The crew already knows these facts now. They have seen them in the archive fragments. They have learned that Carl Sagan chaired the committee that selected the contents. They have studied the cover instructions, the pulsar map, the hydrogen atom time reference, the radioactive clock using uranium-238. They know that the original golden record was made for an unknown receiver, perhaps no receiver at all. But standing before the ship's own version, the meaning changes. Voyager's record was sent outward from a world that still knew itself. This one was carried inward, into the future of a civilization that might forget. That is the quiet cruelty of the chamber. It proves that someone expected loss. Not as a distant possibility, not as a philosophical worry, but as an engineering condition. The builders understood recycling targets, artificial gravity, demographic models, and closed ecological life support. They understood that a deep space habitat would not have frequent resupply from Earth. They understood that water had to loop back at rates approaching completeness, that oxygen had to be recovered from breath, that waste could not simply vanish. They understood that in a generation ship, every material system becomes circular because there is nowhere else to go. And they understood something else. Meaning also leaks. A ship can recycle water. It can recover air. It can process waste. It can keep crops alive beneath controlled light and keep children alive beneath inherited law. But a founding story does not return automatically. It must be taught, renewed, questioned, defended, and translated for people whose world is not the world of their ancestors. That was supposed to be the purpose of the archive. When they activate it, there is no grand awakening of the ship.
No sudden reversal of history. Only a sequence of recovered signals, some visual, some acoustic, some encoded through references that do not depend on any one language. There are diagrams based on physics. There are maps that point not to political borders, but to cosmic bearings. There are images of oceans, animals, human bodies, built environments, storms, instruments, hands. There are natural sounds, patterned and layered, not because every listener would know them, but because a planet makes a kind of music before any civilization writes a score. Then come the voices. The ship's translators struggle at first, not because the data is damaged beyond use, but because the context is so far away. The words are greetings, preserved in many human languages, offered without guarantee that anyone would hear them. Some are formal, some are warm. Some sound almost impossibly fragile. Not because of weakness, but because they come from a species speaking into a darkness larger than its certainty. For the people born aboard, Earth has become many things at once: a coordinate, a biological origin, a forbidden theme, a myth with too much evidence, a risk. The protagonists listen with the others gathered around them, and the old question returns with a new weight. Should this be restored to the entire ship? Not copied quietly into expert systems, not held by a council, not used only to correct navigation history or unlock technical manuals. Restored as origin, restored as education, restored as public memory. Earth is the place that launched the mission, the place whose oceans and forests and laboratories and conflicts produced the vessel, the place that gave the first crew not only bodies and tools, but a reason to leave. There is danger in that. The society aboard the ship is not empty. It has its own rituals, its own loyalties, its own explanations for suffering and duty. For generations, perhaps for far longer, people have lived under rules that made sense without Earth. Farmers along the rotating inner surface have planted because the ship needed food, not because a planet once had fields under open sky. Technicians have repaired life support loops because breath depended on them, not because NASA once described deep space habitats and their need for recycling, reuse, and waste minimization. Children have learned the curvature of their world as normal. The sky above them is the far side of the habitat, not blue air over a horizon. To tell them Earth was real is not a small correction. It changes ancestry. It changes authority. It changes grief. It changes the meaning of every restriction that was justified as survival alone. It may divide those who believe the archive from those who call it contamination. It may expose old suppressions. It may turn mission doctrine into accusation. If someone erased Earth to preserve order, then restoring Earth may reopen the crisis that erasure was meant to prevent. And yet the alternative is also a choice. To leave the archive sealed is not neutrality. It is to continue the silence. It is to accept that the ship can arrive at another star carrying bodies descended from Earth, technologies born from Earth, crops and microbes and languages shaped by Earth, while the living society calls its origin irrelevant or unknowable. It is to let the mission survive by becoming unmoored from the very story that made it possible. This is the final burden the archive places on them. It does not simply answer where they came from. It asks what a civilization owes to its descendants. Project Hyperion imagined a generation ship as more than propulsion and hull. It framed such a vessel as a self-sustaining ecosystem with agriculture, habitation, life support, and social systems capable of lasting for centuries. Its design assumptions included knowledge transfer mechanisms because the descendants are not passengers in the ordinary sense. They are the mission continuing in human form. But knowledge transfer is not only the storage of facts. It is the preservation of significance. A file can state that Proxima Centauri b orbits an M-type star. It can preserve an orbital period of 11.2 days and an orbital distance of about 0.048 astronomical units. It can record that an ARXIV-hosted Heritage Monte Carlo model once estimated a minimum crew of 98 could, under its assumptions, produce a 100% success rate for a 6,300-year multi-generational voyage toward that world. It can store numbers, diagrams, and procedures.
But it cannot force reverence. It cannot guarantee humility.
It cannot make a child understand why a voice from a vanished planet matters.
That work belongs to culture, and culture is more fragile than metal.
So the protagonists do not treat the archive as a simple cure.
They begin with restraint.
They copy it into protected systems.
They gather interpreters, engineers, teachers, and those who still hold authority in the ship's civic order.
They compare the record against life support doctrine, navigation archives, population records, and the hidden histories of suppression.
They do not announce a miracle.
They prepare for a wound to become public. And in that preparation, the ship itself seems different.
The rotating habitat still turns. Artificial gravity still presses feet to the inner surface. Water still moves through recovery systems.
Carbon dioxide still enters the machinery that keeps oxygen in circulation.
Waste still becomes resource
because nothing aboard can truly be thrown away.
Children still wake into lessons.
Workers still cross curved corridors beneath a sky made of distant neighborhoods and agricultural bands.
Nothing has changed. Everything has changed.
Because now the vessel is no longer only a world.
It is also a message.
It carries the long ambition of institutions like NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA Ames Research Center, and the old design imagination of the Stanford Torus and NASA SP-413.
It carries the warning of Biosphere 2 in Oracle, Arizona,
where even a closed ecology on Earth revealed how difficult artificial worlds can be.
It carries the logic of Voyager, which placed a gold-plated copper record on spacecraft leaving the sun, not because anyone promised it would be found, but because a civilization wanted to say, "We were here, and this is what home sounded like."
The crew finally understands why the ship's archive was modeled that way.
The golden record was not built for certainty. It was built for hope without confirmation.
So is this.
The last message from home is not an order to return.
There may be no return route that matters now.
Earth may be unreachable by distance,
by time, or by change.
The archive does not solve the signal.
It does not prove whether the artificial pattern they detected came from Earth, another civilization, or their own forgotten mission infrastructure.
It does not tell them whether Proxima Centauri b will welcome life or refuse it.
It does not remove the demographic, ecological, and political dangers ahead.
It gives them something smaller and perhaps more difficult. Continuity.
Not the comforting kind, where every generation remembers perfectly.
A harsher continuity.
One that admits forgetting.
One that admits fear.
One that admits that a society can build walls around a dangerous truth and call the wall survival. One that admits that memory can wound, but silence can deform. When the first public playback begins, it is not broadcast as spectacle. It enters the ship softly, through schools, civic halls, maintenance decks, farms, clinics, and sleeping quarters.
A sequence of images. A map written in pulsars.
A unit of time drawn from hydrogen.
Greetings in languages almost no one aboard can speak.
Music whose makers are gone beyond recovery.
Sounds of wind and water from a planet most listeners will never stand upon.
Some people weep. Some refuse.
Some are angry that a truth so large was held from them.
Some ask why a place that mattered so much was left behind.
Some ask whether Earth failed them, or saved them, or both. No single answer is honest enough. The ship continues through interstellar dark, carrying its closed breath and its rotating sky, its fragile institutions and its recovered origin. It remains a civilization under constraint, moving toward a star whose planet is known only through distant measures and inherited hope. But now, for the first time in generations, its people can name the contradiction at the center of their existence.
They were not born on Earth. They may never see Earth.
But Earth is still inside the ship. It is in the water loops, in the crops, in the bones adapted to artificial gravity, in the languages buried beneath newer speech, in the old scientific names, in the courage and arrogance of building a vessel meant to outlast its builders. It is in the archive that waited when culture failed. It is in the decision to remember even when remembering may destabilize what forgetting helped preserve.
And that is where the story closes,
Not with arrival and not with certainty, but with a message crossing time inside the very civilization it was meant to save. A species learned enough physics to send machines beyond the planets. It learned enough engineering to imagine habitats that could turn and breathe and feed themselves for centuries. It learned enough astronomy to write maps in pulsars, enough chemistry to mark time with radioactive decay, enough ambition to aim descendants toward another star. And still, it could not guarantee that the meaning of home would survive the journey. That is the final signal from Earth. Not just that humanity existed, not just that it built, launched, calculated, and endured, but that even a civilization capable of crossing the stars can lose the story of why it left unless each generation chooses to carry it again.